and patting her hair as if she couldn't arrange it properly. She wore a dress very similar to the grey dress that she had worn that afternoon, except that this one was white with flecks of silver. "It is absolutely essential that you locate the shadow creature immediately when you get into the dream," she insisted. "Then you must use whatever wits you have to find a way of cornering it, isolating it, and finally exterminating it. We are working on the theory now that the shadow creature actually benefits from being attacked. It is actually nourished by any positive power that you discharge at it with hostile intent. So, everything you do to retaliate against it must be negative. You must reverse your usual feelings. You, Xe, you must think only the finest and most generous of thoughts when you release your discuses at it. You, Lyric, don't attempt to destroy it by tuning your music rifle to the creature's own biorhythms. Try music that is sweet and pure. And then, when you have the shadow creature cornered, RMS-1 and RMS-2 must join together and reverse their power discharge to create an implosive negative field. That should have the effect of reducing the shadow creature to a single indivisible atom of infinite mass. So tiny that it cannot be seen, so heavy that it will simply drop through the fabric of the universe." "To where?" asked Xe, fascinated. Springer laid a hand on his shoulder. "There are places beyond, and there are places beyond. If I could explain it to you in the certain knowledge that you would understand a single word of what I would tell you, then I happily would. But wherever that single atom eventually comes to rest, it will be very far away from your understanding." Somewhere on the other side of Germantown, a clock struck the quarter hour. The night warriors gathered in a circle, their armor shining dully in the bare lamplight, and knelt and intoned the sacred words of Ashopola. "Now when the face of the world is covered with darkness, let us be conveyed to the place of our meeting, armed and armored." They rose through the roof of the house, flickers of light like the aurora borealis, and this time the old man in the Arnold Palmer golfing shirt was standing right opposite, and saw them clearly. He stood for a very long time with his mouth open, watching them turn above the treetops toward Melrose Park. "Holy shit," he whispered to himself. "Ghosts!" The 7 night warriors were absorbed through the hot, oppressive clouds, circling at last above the jigsaw puzzle rooftops of the Odd Fellows Orphans' Home. RMS-2 guided them down toward the wing where Lenny was being kept. He could sense Lenny's presence with such certainty that Reblax felt a twinge of paternal possessiveness. "Lenny's my son. How come you can detect him so clearly?" They descended one by one until they found themselves assembled around Lenny's bed. Reblax looked around the room. Sparse, utilitarian, its walls painted powder blue, on the wall a framed print of Palomino ponies at play. No wonder Lenny hated it here, and wanted so much to be reunited with his father. RMS-1 and RMS-2 connected their power grills. "Just remember," said RMS-1, "we have to locate the shadow creature immediately, no matter where we find ourselves. Then both of us charge keepers are going to need all the defensive fire we can get." "Let's just cut out the chin music and do it," Themesteroth complained. RMS-1 and RMS-2 drew their glowing octagons in the air. Dazzling blue light illuminated Lenny's soft, crimson-flushed cheek as he lay asleep. Reblax could have bent over the bed and kissed him, but this was not the time. Besides, he would soon be far closer to Lenny than a kiss. He would be right inside his dreams. The twin charge-keepers parted the air within their octagons and revealed a rain-lashed parking lot. The night warriors looked at each other in concern. "Where the hell's this?" Archistrax wanted to know, peering into the darkness and the wet. Reblax had recognized the place right away. "Lenny's school," he told them. "It looks like we're going back to class." Without any further hesitation, Oromas 1 and Oromas 2 raised the octagons above their heads and let them slide downward, so that the night warriors entered the dream. The rain was a steady, cold, persistent downpour, misting their faceplates and trickling down their armor. And they were alone. 7 of them on a deserted asphalt parking lot, on a wet night, outside of Benjamin Franklin Grade School on 16th Street in Philadelphia. The parking lot was surrounded by a sagging chicken wire fence. The street beyond it was deserted, except for a few parked automobiles. The school itself was a gloomy 5-story brown brick building, with grimy stone lintels above the windows. In the rain and the darkness, it seemed even more forbidding. Oromas 1 immediately switched on his infrared detecting equipment and scanned the area for any sign of life. "Something in the building," he said.
"Human, or what?"
asked Archistrax, jingling his tool belt. "It's a negative reading. That means it's intrinsically colder than the ambient temperature."
"Can you give us a location?" said Exie.
Oromas 1 adjusted the tuning of his sensor, frowning as he did so. It twitched, kind of. I get the feeling that it knows we're here. Themesteroth activated his rocket rack. Tiny crimson lights glowed all around it, and an amber ready light began to wink steadily on and off. "3rd story, in back," confirmed Oromas 1.
"All right, then," said Themesteroth. "You know what they say in Hill Street Blues? Let's do it to them before they do it to us."
The 7 night warriors fanned out and advanced quickly across the parking lot. They went through to the playground, with Lyrak and Exie ducking beneath the swing set. The school stretched taller and taller as they approached, and by the time they reached the front doors and gazed upward, their eyes flinching against the tumbling rain, it seemed to tower over them 50 stories high, a dark brown cliff of wet, glistening brick. That was the effect of Lenny's dreaming mind, distorting the school so that it looked the way he felt about it. "If we ever get out of this," thought Reblax, "take Lenny out of Benjamin Franklin straight away. I never knew it frightened him this much." Oromas 1 said, "Okay, are we ready? We go in quick. We locate the shadow creature. We blast it." Archistrax tried the double doors. "Locked," he announced. "That doesn't surprise me," said Reblax. "Lenny's always complaining that they make him wait outside on rainy days."
"No sweat," said Archistrax. "I have a little something here that Lenny was never lucky enough to have. Not that his teachers would have approved."
He unclipped from his belt a shining stainless steel gadget that looked like a giant nutcracker. Working with the swiftness of psychically inherited skill, he connected the head of the gadget to the 2 doorknobs and squeezed in the handles. With a sharp, crunching noise, the locks were wrenched out of the doors. They dropped clattering onto the wet, red tiles of the porch. Oromas 2 stepped forward and kicked in the doors, revealing a dark hallway that smelled of school. Blackboard chalk, stale school food, pencils, and sweaty sneakers. The night warriors advanced into the darkness, their feet squeaking on the composition flooring, and paused. "Some goddamn nightmare," whispered Themesteroth. "How could you send your son to a shithole like this?" "It's not as bad as this in real life," said Reblax defensively. "Besides, it has a terrific academic record." "Yep, so did Alcatraz," Themesteroth retorted. Oromas 2, who was sensitive to noises that were right on the edge of human hearing, suddenly said, "Shh! Listen!" They listened. At first, they could hear nothing but the rain sheeting across the playground. Then they heard voices, children's voices, reciting something by rote, over and over and over. "It's upstairs," said Aramas 2. "Let's go check it out." Aramas 1 lifted his hand. "This is it, friends. Good luck, and shoot to kill." Chapter 15. Swiftly, their feet pattering on the concrete, they climbed the wide, gloomy staircase. The only illumination came from a tall window at the top of the stairs. The window was glazed in yellowish, hammered glass and protected from stray baseballs and accurate stones by rusted metal mesh. Although they had plenty of lighting between them, including Reblax's helmet, they decided that it would be safer to make their way forward in the dark. When they reached the second-floor landing, Aramas 1 stopped to check his sensors again. "I'm still getting that strong negative signal from the third floor back. But there's quite an array of smaller signals from the second floor, and they're all negative, too." "Let's check those first," said Themesteroth. "I'm not particularly in love with the idea of going farther upstairs without covering my ass first. That's what Charlie used to do, hide in tunnels and foxholes while we advanced through their lines, then jump up out of nowhere and zap us in the rear." "So you did learn some soldiering in Nam," Archistrax remarked. "I learned more goddamn soldiering than you ever learned about driving cars." "Is that supposed to be funny?" Archistrax snapped back. Reblax laid a hand on Archistrax's armored shoulder. "Relax, will you? We're supposed to be going after the shadow creature, not each other's throats. Now come on. We don't have much time." He led the way on his thin-soled running shoes along the landing and down the corridor. Along the right-hand side, there was a row of identical classroom doors, each with a square window in it. The light from the windows shone on the opposite wall like dim and empty picture frames. All the time, the recitation grew louder, young boys' voices repeating hollow words over and over. Reblax glanced quickly inside the first classroom. It was dark, deserted, with lines of empty desks. The blackboard, however, was densely covered with tiny, illegible writing. Reblax turned to Aramas 1 and said, "Can you read that? What does that say?" Aramas 1 focused his telescopic viewfinder on it. He read only the first few words. "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union—" "The Constitution," said Exie. "That's right," replied Themesteroth. "That bit of paper that makes sure that even slants like you get protected by the law." "Not to mention legless rednecks like you," Lyrak put in. Reblax nodded impatiently to indicate that they should continue, and led the warriors to the next window. The boys' voices were very loud now, although Reblax still couldn't make out what they were saying. He glanced in at the window, and what he saw made him duck back at once. "That's the one," he told Aramas 1. "Check it out for yourself." One after another, the night warriors looked into the classroom. It was shadowy, but they could see that all the desks were occupied by small black figures, their heads covered with hoods, like dwarfish monks. Each figure had a sheet of paper in front of it and was chanting from it, one after the other, one verse at a time. It was the monstrosity that stood beside the blackboard that horrified Reblax the most, however. It was like a gigantic praying mantis, pale and gleaming and shuddery, with long stick-like claws and feelers. Yet, at the very end of its attenuated head, there was a small human face, with black darting eyes and the skin texture of uncooked chicken. It danced awkwardly from one side of the classroom to the other, even more frightening because of its unpredictable jerkiness, and it was obviously conducting the recitation. As it turned around, Reblax saw that its jointed body was knotted around with clothing, a twisted shirt, an inside-out coat, a stringy necktie. It looked as if, by tying clothes around itself, it had tried, wretchedly and unsuccessfully, to make itself look more like a human being. Reblax recognized the stuff of nightmares. This mantis teacher was Lenny's dream impression of Mrs. Schuyler, his math teacher. And what the little black figures were reciting over and over was a garbled version of their times tables.
Once is once. Nonce is nonce. Never nines are fit to fight. 10 tenths are a thunder and sticks.
With an extraordinary pang, Reblax was reminded of his own unhappiness in math lessons, of his childhood inability to make any sense at all out of the numbers that had seemed to pour out of his books like thousands of black ants. And he remembered, too, just how much he had feared and disliked his own math teacher. "I'm getting a strong negative reading from this classroom," said Oromas 1. Reblax turned to Oromas 2. "Is Lenny in there? Can you sense him at all?" Oromas 2 nodded. "He's sitting center front." Themesteroth said, "What do we do? Blast him?" "I'm not sure," said Oromas 1. "I'm not sure what they are, what they represent. It's hard to tell if they're any kind of threat to us or not." "One way to find out," said Reblax. "Go into the classroom and ask them, but for Christ's sake, if any shooting starts, watch out for Lenny. If we heard his dream presence, we could very well kill him. And ourselves, too." "Gotcha," said Themesteroth. Carefully, Reblax turned the doorknob and opened the classroom door. At once, the chanting of tables died away. There was a chilly rustle, and all the black-hooded figures turned around at their desks. Oromas, too, had been right. Lenny was sitting center front, white-faced, although he didn't appear to recognize his father at all. As for the other figures, however, it was impossible for Reblax to see their faces. They were completely buried in shadow. He was struck by the chilliness of the air and a sickly smell like dying flowers or rotting meat. In the gloom of the room, the mantis teacher clicked and clattered its claws and stared at him with emotionless eyes.
"What do you want?"
it whispered in a voice that sounded half choked by a hairball.
"You could have had the grace to knock."
"Mrs. Schuyler?" Reblax asked. Behind him, he felt Themesteroth pushing forward, and he could hear the high-pitched whine of Themesteroth's launch mechanism building up to full power. There was a second's hesitation, and then Mrs. Schuyler came lurching across the classroom toward him.
"You're late, child. You'll have to be punished."
Her claws scraped on the classroom floor. "Reblax," warned Oromas 1. "Negative feedback just surged up." Reblax stepped quickly backward. As he did so, Mrs. Schuyler slashed a claw at him and slit open the shining blue armor over his chest like a fisherman's knife slitting open a trout. He felt a thrill of utter cold and then a surge of pain. Instantly, the dwarfish black figures swarmed out of their places and came rushing across the classroom. "Fire!" shouted Oromas 1, and Themesteroth launched a thunderous rocket from his backpack that hit the classroom ceiling and ricocheted back into the crowd of figures. There was a dull, thumping implosion, and 3 of the figures were sucked into oblivion. Hastily, the night warriors retreated from the classroom and back along the corridor, but the black figures came hurrying after them. Themesteroth stopped, turned, and prepared to launch a second rocket, but one of the figures caught up with him and sliced at his legs with glinting claws.
"What the hell?"
he roared as the claws raked into unprotected thigh muscle. He kicked out in all directions as more black figures clustered around him, their claws lifted, their feet scurrying. Lyrak had reached the landing. He knelt down on one knee and lifted his music rifle, clamping the mask to his face. His fingers played deftly over the strings. Reblax, who was right beside him, heard a musical note rise from deep, vibrant inaudibility to C natural, to F sharp, reaching a pitch of utmost clarity and sweetness, so sweet that it was almost unbearable to listen to. The 4 or 5 dwarves who were slashing with such fury at Themesteroth's thighs and ankles stopped suddenly and turned, transfixed by the pitch of Lirac's rifle. Without hesitation, Lirac pulled the trigger, and the musical note screeched out of the rifle's multiple panpipe barrels with a sound like a banshee. The black figures imploded one after the other, in rapid succession in a jumping blizzard of dust and shredded black cloth.
"Bo days Voss!" shouted Archistrax.
Themesteroth, meanwhile, was able to kick away another black figure and hobble back to the landing. There were 7 of the small black figures remaining. Behind them, the pale, insect-like teacher dragged its claws along the corridor, head swaying uncontrollably from side to side. Reblax was chillingly reminded of the noise he had heard outside his bedroom that night that Jennifer had died. Oromas I said, "Do we have any idea what these half-assed bastards are?" Reblax nodded. "I can guess what's happened. Last night when I was fighting the shadow creature, I cut a piece of it away, and that piece turned into lots of small pieces and ran off like spiders. It's the same thing that happens to plantar worms, isn't it? You try to chop them up, but each piece grows into another worm." Lirac tuned up another note and fired at the figures again. One of them burst inward in a shower of shredded cloth, but the others rushed forward before Lirac could adjust his aim. It was Exe's turn now. He stepped toward the advancing figures with consummate grace and control, his hands raised in the hawk positions of kung fu. One of the discs on the front of his samurai-like helmet was gleaming in readiness, filling the corridor with reflected rainbows. For one long, heart-stopping moment, Reblax thought that Exe was unable to summon up the psychic energy to launch his disc. He released the metal crescent from his hand and began to swing it on a short wire in case Exe failed.
"Exe!"
bellowed Themesteroth, struggling to reset his rocket launcher.
"Hit him, for Christ's sake!"
Themesteroth lurched forward, but Oromas II lifted a hand to restrain him. Oromas II had sensed the perfection of Exe's technique. He could feel the complicated psychic vibrations that Exe was giving out, and knew that Exe would choose exactly the right instant to concentrate them all into firing his thought disc. The dwarf figures surged forward, then hesitated. Behind them, the teacher cried out,
"Punishment! Punishment! That's what they deserve!"
But at the instant that the dwarf figures shuffled closer again, Exe let out a cry of "Hail!" and the rainbow-shining disc whipped from his helmet, cutting diagonally through the cluster of black figures, then diagonally back again, faster and faster, chopping them into thousands of black fragments right in front of their eyes. The disc flew so quickly and so precisely that in less than 3 seconds the dwarf figures fell into a soft cloud of shadowy dust, as if they had never existed. Every cut had been mentally planned, and the disc had followed Exe's mental programming to the last millimeter.
"Look at that!"
Archistrax breathed.
"This joker ought to get a job at Benihana."
"Don't leave the dust," cautioned Oromas I. "You heard what Reblax said. If you tear the shadow creature into pieces, it could regenerate itself." Exe raised his hand. "I had no intention, honorable warrior, of leaving the dust." The rainbow-shining disc had been wobbling unsupported in the air, just above the remains of the black dwarf creatures. Exe frowned at it, and it began to wobble even faster, faster and faster, until it formed a gleaming hourglass shape in the air. All of the greyish dust that was scattered on the floor of the corridor was sucked up by the vacuum that the spinning disc had created, and compressed in the narrowest part of the hourglass shape, smaller and smaller, until it winked darkly once, and vanished. Exe snapped his fingers, and the disc slowed, described a lazy, graceful curve in the air, and returned to his helmet. All this time, the insect-like figure had been clattering and clashing from one side of the corridor to the other, eyes swivelling, head swaying, although it had made no further attempts to attack. Now that its black brood had been destroyed, however, and it was outnumbered by the night warriors 7-1, it began, without warning, to change. Its face melted like pink wax, its limbs thickened, its knotted clothes unwound themselves. Claws reassembled themselves into hands, feelers shrank into ears. The jointed thorax shrank and shriveled. In a few moments, he had metamorphosed into a human, an emaciated, shortish man with a forehead as large and pale as a lamp and lank black hair. A man in dishevelled, old-fashioned clothes and a tightly knotted cravat. Archistrax said, "Holy criminantles! Edgar Allan Poe on his day off!" Lyrac had been tuning his music rifle to exterminate the mantis creature, but now he stood up in bewilderment, took 2 paces back, and looked to Reblax and Oramas I for guidance on what he should do. "Just hold it a minute," said Reblax. He was still spinning his metal crescent on a short 10-inch wire. He pushed past Lyrac and Themesteroth and approached the man as close as he thought was safe. The man had been looking down at the floor. As Reblax approached, he raised his eyes and stared at him.
"Night warriors," he said in a husky whisper. "I thought that I might have seen the last of your kind."
"Who are you?" Reblax demanded. "What are you doing in my son's dream?" The man gave a slanting smile and kept tugging at his cravat as if he had a nervous compulsion.
"With dreams, mon ami, it is sometimes difficult to determine who is in whose."
His smile disappeared. He clasped his hands behind his back and cracked his knuckles, one hand after the other.
"Is Lenny dreaming me, or am I dreaming Lenny? Or are you dreaming both of us, or none of us? Dreams within dreams, mon ami."
Oramas I interrupted. "Reblax, I'm picking up increased negative feedback from the 3rd story back. Drop in temperature. -22 Celsius. The man in the old-fashioned black suit laughed, showing off brown stumps of teeth.
"The principal!" he cried out. "Do you want me to send you to the principal?"
"We'll find him ourselves, thanks," Reblax told him.
"Maybe you will," the man said, grinning. "But you didn't come properly equipped, did you? I wouldn't feel confident about going to the principal if I were you, not without a book down the back of your pants."
Oramas I said, "Come on, Reblax. We're wasting time. This fruitcake isn't going to tell us anything." "All right," Reblax agreed, without taking his eyes off the man in the black suit. "Let's get up to the 3rd floor."
"Unwise," the man warned them, wagging a chalky finger. "Very unwise."
"For Christ's sake, Reblax," said Themesteroth. "Zap him, and let's get moving." Reblax hesitated. "Just a minute," he said, and approached the man closer. The man held his ground without flinching and leered up at Reblax with rheumy eyes. "What do you mean? We didn't come properly equipped?" he demanded. The man sniffed and abruptly laughed, so that mucus sprayed from his nose. He wiped it away with the back of his sleeve and said,
"Innocents! Not like the night warriors used to be. Wise and tough in the old days you people used to be. Wise and tough. But I knew you were tyros the moment I saw you. Not properly equipped, mon ami, and now it's death for you and no mistake."
"You've known night warriors before." The man looked sly.
"Wouldn't you like to know? But why should I help you? Too pure and saintly you are, Just like that Governor Morris. Just like that Rufus King. Come on, Reblax, for Christ's sake, Themesteroth gripped.
Reblax, he's right. Please, Oromas I insisted. That negative feedback, it's moving. It's coming toward the third-story landing. But Oromas II came up and laid a hand on Reblax's shoulder. You are right to question this man, he said, and his voice was very soft and very steady. You sense in this man what I sense. Reblax stared at the man steadily. Nathan Grant, he said quietly, but with great confidence. You're Nathan Grant. The man's eyes bulged, and he sniffed and blew spit. Nathan Grant? You believe that I'm Nathan Grant? How dare you? I am all that remains of Nathan Grant, but I am not Nathan Grant in flesh and blood and Holy Spirit, amen. Oh, no. Nathan Grant in flesh and blood and Holy Spirit was sizzled by the Night Warriors. Sizzled, sizzled, sizzled like raw beefsteak. And his wife, too. And his saintly daughter. Reblax, man, come on! Lyrak yelled at him. Daughter, Reblax persisted. What do you mean, daughter? You had 2 daughters, didn't you? Nora and Kathleen. Nathan Grant lifted one leg and danced a little jig around the corridor, amusing but frightening at the same time, the dance of a spirit possessed. Yes, yes, 2 daughters, 2 daughters, Nora the one, Kathleen the other. And slow from birth, both of them, slow, 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 but good for trading in their way, helpful and obliging. Both took the Mist-Eye seed quite happily, no complaints, and bore their burdens to Philadelphia, no complaints. Both big with Shadow Child. Ha, ha! And would have borne them too, except for Rufus King and you Night Warriors, curse your sanctity, chasing them here and chasing them there, awake and dreaming, no place to escape. Except, of course, for clever, clever Kathleen, hiding herself in the wall place we'd made. And we plastered her up. And she knew that she'd die, but smiled about it, and kept herself awake so that the Night Warriors wouldn't find her, but cleaved to her bigness, didn't she, my angel Kathleen? He was hopping more slowly now, hopping like a man in a fit. But the tears for his lost Kathleen were trickling down his chicken-skin cheeks. Oh, but it was all worthwhile, wasn't it? He asked. For his lord and master is back now, isn't he? Good as ever, bad as ever, and nothing that you can do can stop him. Themesteroth bellowed, Sick him, Reblax, you turkey! My God, said Reblax, stunned by what Nathan Grant had told him. Kill him, will you? Archistrax shouted. We've got to get out of here! Reblax hesitated. He knew that they had to destroy the shadow creature, and destroy it quickly, but there was so much more that he wanted to ask Nathan Grant. Nathan Grant grinned at him. Come on, mon ami, you can kill me if you want. Much good may it do you. The school building began to shake and tremble. Pieces of masonry dropped from the sides of the staircase and shattered in the hallway below. He's coming! Shrieked Nathan Grant. The principal! Ha ha! Now you'll be punished! Now you'll be sorry! And you're not prepared! Not prepared at all! Reblax allowed 3 more feet of wire to lash out from his wrist. He spun it faster and faster until it shrieked. And all the while, the school rumbled and shook, and windows shattered, and desks careened from one side of the classrooms to the other, and, with an ear-shattering crack, a huge lightning-jagged split appeared in the side of the building, right up to the massive yellow-glazed window. The rain poured in through the slit and misted the stairs with wet. Oromas 1 clutched at Reblax's arm. "Reblax, come on! We've lost the initiative! We've got to fight this rearguard! Reblax, it's coming for God's sake!" Reblax released as much wire as the narrowness of the corridor would allow, and spun it, so fast that it would have taken off a man's hand if that man had been foolish enough to reach out to touch it. And just at the moment that he was ready to whip off Nathan Grant's head, Lenny's dream personality came running out of the classroom, white-faced and crying, and Nathan Grant snatched Lenny's cloak and spun him around and lifted him up. "Hey!" and pressed his cheek close to his. "Champ, champ, don't you run off now, champ." Grinning, loving every moment of it. Smooth 9-year-old skin pressed suction tight up against withered, long-dead chicken skin. "Come on, mon ami," Grant laughed. "Take my head off! Take my head off! Chop, 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 my fine feathered night warrior, just the way your ancestors sizzled me. But Lenny's head will go too. 2 heads with 1 stroke. 1 stroke, 2 heads. What a story that could make." Lenny screamed and kicked, his eyes wild, but there was nothing that Reblax could do. He kept on whipping the wire around and advanced on Nathan Grant step by step, but Nathan Grant taunted him and laughed and kept Lenny's cheek squashed tight against his. "Take my head off! Take my head off!" And at the same time, the concrete landing creaked and grated and started to tilt sideways. Something was descending the upper part of the staircase from the 3rd floor. Something dark, something huge. Something that dragged itself along the flooring with a noise like 30 canvas sacks crammed with drowned dogs. Something with claws that scraped along the walls, stripping off ribbons of olive drab paint. The fear of death, the grisly principle of Lenny's nightmare school. Oromas 1 frantically checked his senses. "It's on its way down. It's after us. Come on, Reblax. We need to get out of here, and fast." Oromas 2 grasped Reblax's left wrist. "It's all right. You don't have to worry about the boy. It's only a dream. Grant can't hurt him. The only person who can hurt him is you." Lenny fought hysterically against Nathan Grant, but Grant clasped Lenny tighter still, kissing him with liver-colored lips, licking his cheeks with a long tongue that seemed to have an existence of its own. Reblax shouted, "No!" But Oromas 2 tugged him back and snapped at him, "If you don't come, now, I'm going to drain down your power." From upstairs, the sound of dragging grew thunderously louder. It began to descend the stairs. Lightning flashed through the gaping cracks in the collapsing school building, and for 1 split second it illuminated a gigantic black-cloaked shape on the rain-swept stairway, with curved claws as long as swords, and a body that was tangled black gristle, and eyes dull red like raging sores. Then darkness again, and the thunderous dragging, and the cold, drenching sensation of absolute fear. Reblax took one last desperate look at Lenny, struggling in the grip of Nathan Grant, and then he turned away. Lyrak and Archistrax were already halfway down the stairs, and Themesteroth and Exii were close behind. Oromas 1 shouted, "We'll regroup. Set up an ambush. Then we can make sure that we hit it dead center." Nathan Grant, instantly realizing that his play to make Reblax kill Lenny's dream personality had failed, threw Lenny aside. Lenny tumbled over and over in the air and miraculously rumbled himself into a bright blue ball, which bounced along the corridor with a happy spanking sound. Grant, however, came tearing after Reblax in a hissing fury. As Nathan Grant ran, claws opened out from the skin of his chest with a sickening tearing sound. His neck stretched out, and his face was pulled back into an insect-like mask with teeth upon teeth. He jumped onto Reblax's back and clung there, scratching and biting. Reblax twisted and turned and scrabbled behind him in a frantic effort to dislodge this insect Grant from his shoulders. But Grant dug spiny quills into Reblax's skin and gripped the back of his helmet between two layers of teeth. And even when Reblax backed up and crushed him against the wall again and again with a ghastly crunching sound like treading on grasshoppers, Grant refused to relax his grip.
"Reblax!" shouted Lyrac. "Turn around again! Turn around!"
Reblax staggered around, gripping the banister railing for support. His shoulder muscles stung as if they had been lashed with razor wire, and Grant was beginning to bite and snap at the back of his neck. And all the time, the shadow creature was dragging itself down the stairs, stair after stair, so that its darkness began to blot out the light from the huge yellow-glazed window. Lyrac lifted his music rifle, fitted the sight mask onto his face, tuned, and fired. Reblax heard an extraordinary shriek of pure music, 50 sopranos, 200 violins. On his back, the insect Grant jerked and shuddered, and then abruptly exploded in a spray of hairy shell and pints of glutinous yellow liquid.
"I won!" Themesteroth bellowed. "Now, let's haul ass!"
Close together, they sprinted down the slippery wet stairs, skidding on the composition flooring in the hallway. They jostled out of the school's main doors into the pouring rain and jogged across the playground. It was only when they reached the swing set that they turned around and looked at the collapsing school building. Dark brown against a darker sky, it crumbled and fell. Huge chunks of masonry dropped into the playground and burst apart. Lintels, guttering, chimneys, windows, it all came down, with a sound like the ocean shattering on the shore. And then, behind the yellow-glazed window, they saw the darkest of shapes. The shadow creature, bloated on human terror, nourished on human darkness, reared behind the glass, and was momentarily silhouetted by lightning.
"God almighty!"
said Archistrax. The yellow-glazed window exploded. Glass fragments blew slow motion into the rainy night, turning over and over.
"Back!" ordered Oromas I. "I want you all the hell out of here!"
Nobody questioned his command. But when they turned to run, they discovered that the swing set had somehow transformed itself into a complicated metal barrier, a puzzle fence of poles and bars and chains.
"We're trapped," said Lyrac.
But Exii lifted his hand and said,
"Wait! This is only a maze, and all mazes can be penetrated."
He pressed his fingertips against his forehead and closed his eyes, and one of his discs began to glow. He released it, and it flew from his helmet with a soft zhap, and twisted and turned its way through the fence of metal poles, leaving behind it a glowing after-image.
"All we have to do is follow the disc," said Exii. "There is no combination of metal shapes that was not known to the ancient Chinese. The disc has all the knowledge of the ancients, as well as all the technology of today."
Archistrax was already clambering through the metal poles.
Themesteroth grumbled, "Could have blasted them just as easy."
"Yes," said Exii with a smile, "but rockets use a great deal of psychic energy, and that is what we must conserve above all."
They clambered through the bars of the swing set and then ran across the parking lot, their feet splashing in the puddles. Even as they ran, however, the dream began to alter and shift, and they found that they were running along a wide corridor with mirrored walls, so that it looked as if endless teams of night warriors were all running together toward the same objective. At first, the corridor was bright, but as they ran forward, it became narrower and dimmer, and its gradient became steeper, until at last it was too steep for them to climb. Archistrax said, "Hold on!" and braced himself against the wall and switched on a powerful flashlight that was attached to his shoulder. The flashlight revealed a corridor that sloped up at more than a 60-degree angle, until it reached a black 6-paneled door with a shining brass handle. But the door was more than 200 feet away.
"What do we do now?" asked Lirac. "We can't go back. That black thing is going to have us for breakfast with a side order of grits."
Archistrax lowered his structural theorizer in front of his eyes and punched a complex arrangement of buttons on his left chest, almost like a miniature accordion. Leaning close to Archistrax, Reblax could see Archistrax's screen light up and a plan of the sloping tunnel appear, in holographic 3D. Immediately, the screen projected a picture of a spiral, rather like the core of an Archimedes screw, and beneath the picture a box appeared, crammed with technological data. "Can you do it?" asked Oramas 1 anxiously.
"No sweat,"
Archistrax replied. He reached behind him and unhooked from his belt a heavy cylindrical instrument that looked like a flashlight. He adjusted 2 slide switches on the side of it, and then he knelt down and aimed it at the wall of the sloping corridor. A sickly wind began to blow along the corridor, and Exii retched.
"Death," he said. "It smells like death."
But Archistrax's instrument was glowing now, and out of its muzzle a thin silvery beam of pure energy began to stream, following the same spiral path that his structural theorizer had plotted. It came out slowly at first, but then it poured out faster and faster, until with one final spin it had created a perfect spiral of shining metal all the way up to the black door.
"Cool tool, huh?"
said Archistrax, holding up the instrument, then clipping it back onto his belt.
"Takes any metallic content out of the air and makes it into usable metal."
"Well, great," said Themesteroth. He jerked his head toward the spiral. "But how does that help? That half-assed Disneyland ride?" Without answering, Archistrax reached into the bag that he carried around his waist and tossed to each of them a small bracket-shaped piece of shining copper-colored metal.
"All you have to do is attach that to your belt, right round at the back, and connect it up to the metal spiral. That's all. The power of Ashipola will do the rest."
Oramas 2 went first. He seemed to have developed a quiet assurance during the course of this second dream, and a closer understanding of what they were doing. The world of dreams might have turned out to be a world of madness, but at the same time it was still bounded by the limited parameters of the human imagination. What was unimaginable couldn't be dreamed. What was imaginable could be dealt with, one way or another. Oramas 2 slotted the copper bracket into the back of his armor, then moved carefully backwards until it connected with the metal spiral that Archistrax had laid up the angled corridor.
"Okay, go,"
said Archistrax. Without any hesitation, Oramas 2 slid up the spiral, around and around, until he reached the black doorway at the top. He braced himself against the sides of the corridor like a rock climber and called back, "Fantastic! Come on up!" Quickly, one by one, they spiraled their way up the corridor until they had all joined Oramas 2 by the door. Archistrax connected a complicated arrangement of stainless steel levers to the door handle and forced it open without any effort at all. Oramas 2 raised the door cautiously, like a manhole cover, and immediately they felt a freezing wind blow down the corridor. "Night time," commented Oramas 2, "and damned cold, too." They climbed out of the doorway to find themselves standing in a bleak, gale-tossed garden. Reblax recognized it at once. It was the garden he had seen last night, the garden in which he had fought the shadow creature. He wished that there was some way in which he could contact Diane and make sure that she was photographing everything that he could see. The ink-black sky, the sour and shriveled grass, the crisscross pathways, the sightless statues. He walked ahead of the rest of the night warriors, the grass stinging against his legs. Where had he seen this garden before? Where had he seen that door before? It was all so familiar, in spite of its coldness. It was somewhere that he and Lenny had been together. It must be. But where? It wasn't Fairmount Park, and it wasn't the Brandywine Valley, and it wasn't even Neptune, New Jersey. Oromas, too, came up close behind him. "This is the place, isn't it?" he asked. "The place you mentioned from yesterday's dream." Reblax nodded. His eyes scanned the black horizon for any sign of the shadow creature. "It's here somewhere. I swear it." "Have you ever been in this garden before?" asked Oromas I, looking around him as he approached. "Nope," said Reblax. "But it's familiar for some reason. Don't ask me why." Oromas I switched on his sensors. "You're right. It is here. 300 meters south-southwest." Archistrax double-checked that bearing on his own equipment. "You're right. Lenny's perception of north is spot-on true north." Oromas II said, "The shadow creature knows we're here. It knows we're trying to hunt it down."
"How can you tell a thing like that?"
Themestroth demanded. Oromas II tapped his helmet. "I can sense it. It's mad. It's been waiting for 200 years, and now we're trying to kill it. I mean, wouldn't you be mad if that happened to you?"
"I don't give a shit whether it's mad or not. I'm going to waste it," Themestroth told him.
With a lopsided smile, Oromas II went back to talk to his twin. Oromas I was already suggesting that they should fan out and make their way through the garden separately. Reblax could tell that by the way he kept sweeping his arm from side to side. He sat down on the corner of one of the marble graves. He was feeling exhausted, especially after seeing Lenny threatened so lewdly by Nathan Grant. He knew that Lenny hadn't been physically or mentally harmed. After all, Lenny was still dreaming this dream, which he wouldn't have been able to do if he were hurt. But, all the same, Reblax was beginning to feel the strain of fighting a battle in which he was so closely involved. His emotions were stretched out like high-tension wires. Oromas I came over and hunkered down in the grass. "We've decided to search this garden by sections, the same way we do in Philly in the Italian district, when we suspect somebody of harboring a felon." Reblax said, "There's a key to the whole damned business somewhere here." "Yes, well, maybe there is," said Oromas I. "But right now, we've got ourselves a shadow creature to kill." "All right," said Reblax. "Tell me what you want me to do." They powered up their weapons and started to search the garden systematically. It was pitch dark and nerve-wracking. All they could see was the light from their own helmets, sometimes close, sometimes far away, and the pale, blind statues that stood at every intersection. From time to time they called to each other with echoing voices, but most of the time they were silent and tense as they patrolled through sepulchres and tombs, their weapons raised at the ready. Their lights dipped and bobbed like the lights of fireflies, weaving a pattern through the night. Oromas I said, "I've lost it. I'm still scanning. It could be anywhere."
"Thanks for the backup, pal," said Themestroth. "We're supposed to hit that mother right where it lives. No deviation, no error. Not 1 centimeter left or right. Full negative blast. So don't start telling me that it could be anywhere."
"Can it, Themestroth?" said Reblax.
"The hell you say,"
Themestroth retorted. They searched the gardens again and again, but it had taken them only one search to convince themselves that the shadow creature had vanished. Bitterly, Reblax said, "I'll bet you real money that it's back in the waking world, slashing somebody to death."
"Oh, come on, man," said Archistrax. "Don't let it get to you."
"And why not, for Christ's sake? Jennifer was my wife. The Fellings were my friends. I loved them all. And I love Lenny, too." Archistrax said nothing, but bowed his head. Reblax got up and walked across to Oromas 1, who was studiously scanning the horizon for any sign of approaching danger.
"Oromas," he said.
"What is it, Reblax?"
"He's not here, Oromas. You know that as well as I do. We'd be better off back in the waking world."
Oromas 1 stood up. "I guess you're right. I just hope that nobody got hurt." Reblax took hold of his hand and squeezed it tight.
"Come on, buddy. Not your fault."
Oromas 1 beckoned to Oromas 2.
"Let's do it," he said. "Let's get ourselves back. This is like looking for hay in a haystack."
They gathered together, disappointed, fearful, but ready to leave.
"I'm sorry, people," said Reblax. "Maybe we should have hit the big one first and left all those dwarves till later. But they were dangerous, those dwarves. You saw how dangerous. And we couldn't have gone for the big one with those gonzos snapping at our heels. I'm just hoping and praying that nobody got hurt tonight."
Reblax took a last look around the garden in the hope that his impressions would register clearly in Diane Wesley's visual senses. In particular, he focused his attention on the cracked marble sepulchre with the letters Om, Ye, Va, Sh engraved on it. He was about to turn around to the rest of the night warriors and say, "Okay, let's get out of here," when the sun appeared, bright and warm, and the garden faded as if it had been painted in thin colours on theatrical gauze. The night warriors looked around to discover that they were standing on a flat, sandy beach. This beach was less forbidding than the dry, sandy-brown shoreline they had visited yesterday. The sea was clear and sparkling blue, and the sand was powdery white. In the distance, on a long, thin spit of land, Reblax could make out coconut palms and yucca.
"Any sign of the shadow creature?" he demanded.
Oromas 1 shook his head with frustration.
"I had it there. I had it. Right on the edge of my screen. And what happened? I don't know. It blipped and vanished, and that was it."
They walked for a while along the waterline. The sea lapped softly at the ribs of sand. The warm wind blew in their faces. 7 men enjoying a child's dream, leaving their footprints in the beach of his young imagination. Reblax turned and gazed out at the distant horizon and caught sight of a bright blue ball bobbing in the waves.
"Lenny's safe," he thought. "But has anybody else been hurt?"
Chief Molyneux left police headquarters at 10:05. He stood on the steps outside, his crumpled summer coat hung over his arm, his necktie loose, the back of his shirt stained with sweat. It was as hot now as it had been at midday, and the humidity was higher. He hated Philadelphia in the summer. He could never sleep, and the back of his neck always broke out in a rash where his collar had been rubbing. He walked along the street for a while. Even at the intersections, there was no relieving breeze. A thin black man in a sagging straw hat stood on one corner playing the clarinet, an old jazz tune called Milneberg Joys. Chief Molyneux stood close to him for a while, listening.
"Hot night tonight, Chief Molyneux," the black man said after he had finished. "Got me steam coming out of this licorice stick instead of spit."
Chief Molyneux grunted. Then he said,
"Franklin, do you believe in the supernatural? Ghosts and such?"
"Ghosts, Chief?"
"Oh, I don't know. Ghosts or spirits, whatever you like to call them."
Franklin thoughtfully wiped his clarinet with a large cloth that had once been somebody's best spotted shirt.
"Can't say that I ever thought about it, Chief, but my mammy believed in leprechauns."
"Your mammy believed in leprechauns? Only Irish people believe in leprechauns."
"That's what I kept trying to tell her, Chief.
But she was my grandma's 12th child, and the official statistics say that every 12th child born in America is Irish. So she always figured that's what she was. Chief Molyneux smacked Franklin on the back and shook his head. Franklin wheezed with laughter.
I ought to run you in for telling stories like that, Chief Molyneux told him.
He crossed the street. As he did so, a yellow cab came around the corner, and he hailed it.
You want to take me to Patterson Avenue?
He asked the cabbie, sliding across the sticky back seat. The cab pulled away from the curb, but then Chief Molyneux leaned forward and said,
Listen, I changed my mind. Take me to the Oddfellows Orphans' Home.
That's out at Melrose Park, right?
That's the place.
Chief Molyneux sat back. He didn't quite know why he wanted to check on Lenny Woods. Maybe it was the way that John Woods had spoken so worriedly on the telephone this afternoon, insisting that his son be kept securely locked up. Maybe he found the supernatural aspects of this case too intriguing to ignore. It had been a strain keeping the commissioner and the press satisfied that his detectives were doing everything they could to track down the Philly slasher, as the supposed murderer was being referred to. And what had made his job especially difficult was his growing belief that John Woods and Diane Wesley and the Clay twins were quite right about the murderer being not of this world, but some apparition from the next. But all the same, Chief Molyneux found this investigation fascinating. How did you go about tracking down a demon? How did you arrest it when you did? Was it a problem for the law, or the church, or your own conscience? He wasn't at all sure how he was going to deal with it, and that's what he liked. Unpredictability, excitement. He hadn't felt the old adrenaline surging like this for years and years. He reached into his folded coat and took out a small pigskin-covered hip flask. He swallowed a mouthful of whiskey and shuddered a little as it went down. By the time they reached the orphan's home, thunder was beginning to grumble and collide over the Delaware River. Chief Molyneux paid off the cabbie and shrugged on his coat. He walked through the darkness of the orphanage garden between low, clipped yew hedges until he reached the wing where Lenny was being held. A globe lamp above the door was clustered with moths and flies. Inside, a cop was sitting on a folding chair, eating a cheese and tomato sandwich and reading Lord of the Rings. Chief Molyneux approached him on squeaky shoes, and the cop put down his book and held his sandwich behind his back.
At ease, Chief Molyneux told him. Even cops are allowed to eat once in a while. How's the prisoner?
Not a squeak, the officer replied. I've checked him a couple of times, but he hasn't moved. Guess the poor little bastard's totally bushed.
Chief Molyneux sniffed.
Anybody else been in to see him?
No, sir, nobody.
Okay, said Chief Molyneux. Why don't you open up for me, so I can take a look for myself?
Sure thing.
The cop lifted down a bunch of keys from a hook on the wall and opened the plain oak door.
Goddamned hot in here, he remarked. Goddamned air conditioner's been on the fritz for most of the night. Would have opened the window, but the orders said no.
Those were my orders, Chief Molyneux reminded him.
Yes, sir, Chief,
the cop acknowledged. He unlocked the second door and opened it. Chief Molyneux stepped into Lenny's bedroom and was immediately struck by the chill.
Thought you said it was hot in here, he whispered to the cop. This kid's gonna die of frostbite before we have the chance to question him.
Maybe the air conditioning's been fixed, the cop suggested. I'll turn the thermostat up.
Hey, said Chief Molyneux,
nodding his head across the room.
The window's open. You said you kept those windows closed.
The cop was completely perplexed.
Sir, I promise you, I never even touched those windows. Never even touched them.
Chief Molyneux quietly crossed the room, glancing at Lenny lying asleep. He reached out for the open window and swung it shut. Then, in the darkness, he peered at the lock.
It's been forced. Twisted. Looks like somebody used a chisel on it.
The cop joined him by the window and inspected the damaged lock.
I don't know how the hell that happened, sir. I checked this room less than a half hour ago.
Chief Molyneux looked back at the bed. Lenny was breathing deeply and regularly, and was obviously sound asleep. Nobody fell deeply asleep like that in a matter of minutes.
You checked this room a half hour ago, and this window was shut, locked shut. I swear it, sir. I made a point of checking the lock.
Chief Molyneux sniffed.
Thing is, patrolman, this lock has been forced from the inside. So, either you forced it, or the boy forced it, or...
He stopped in mid-sentence. He swung open the window and stared out at the darkened grounds of the orphanage. There was no wind. The night was as heavy as a damp Turkish towel. No cicadas sang. All he could hear was the burbling of a television from the staff quarters.
Pobre mío, tú empaste este terreno con algunos bidones de petróleo al que pagaste fuego.
What's wrong, sir? The cop asked him.
Chief Molyneux reached into his shoulder holster and lifted out his revolver.
Patrolman. What's your name, patrolman?
Gilman, sir. Eugene Gilman.
Well, Gilman, I want you to call in some backup. And then I want you to come straight back here and keep an eye on Lenny Woods for me.
Where will you be, sir?
I'm going out into the gardens. That's where I'm going.
Any particular reason, sir?
Chief Molyneux jerked his head around and stared at Officer Gilman as if he were mad. But what was he going to say? That he was going out into the grounds of the orphanage to hunt down a demon?
We have a fugitive situation here, Gilman. Armed and dangerous.
Sir, Chief, there was nobody else in this room, sir, apart from the boy. I checked, sir, swear to God.
Chief Molyneux gave him a tight smile and gripped his arm.
Yes, Gilman, I know that. Now do as you're told, will you? And get me that backup.
Yes, sir, Chief.
Chief Molyneux closed the window and wedged the lock so that Lenny would find it impossible to open. Then he told Officer Gilman to lock both doors.
Don't be too damn long on that telephone, he said. I want you back here guarding this door pronto.
Yes, sir, Chief.
Keeping his revolver raised, Chief Molyneux left the building and went out into the muggy night. He paused for a moment under the moth-infested lamp, listening. Then he skirted the side of the building and stepped over one of the low hedges onto the lawn. Halfway across the lawn, in the rhomboid of light thrown onto the grass from the open window of the staff quarters, he paused again.
Damn that goddamn television, he muttered.
You, same again. Ese día era un fenómeno. Hay que ver cómo se le paga.
It was then that he thought he heard a rustling in the tall firs along the back of the gardens. He waited and listened. Then he heard it again, and this time he saw their frondy tops swaying, black against a black sky. There was no wind tonight, so that meant that somebody was moving around in there. Somebody or something. Cautiously, Chief Molyneux advanced across the lawn on tiptoe, both arms raised to give himself balance. A fat man's dangerous ballet. He reached the line of firs, and he stopped and listened again, and sniffed. He parted the fir trees with the muzzle of his revolver and took one step forward into the shadows. He heard it again, louder this time, closer, that dragging sound.
"Who's there?"
he demanded, frightened by the loudness of his own voice. The dragging sound continued, somewhere behind the firs. Chief Molyneux moved eater-wise through the trees, his breath held tight, his revolver cocked, sweat rolling down the middle of his chubby back. He stopped again, listened. Something shifted, off to his immediate left. He backed away, groping behind him for the nearest tree, anything to protect his ass.
"Who's there?" he repeated. "Whoever you are, you're committing trespass. and I want you out of those bushes where I can see you. I'm going to give you a count of 5, and if you don't show yourself by the time I'm through counting, I'm going to fire. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You're a trespasser, and I'm a police officer, and if you don't come out of those bushes and show yourself, I'm going to shoot. That's fair warning. Do you understand what I mean by fair warning?
Chief Molyneux backed up a little more, his revolver held out in front of him, and then 3 claws, each as long as a Japanese samurai sword, crunched into his back and sliced out of the front of his shirt. He looked down at his belly, shocked. The 3 claws protruded from his stomach nearly 9 inches, quivering slightly, the way that a man's hand quivers when he grasps something he really wants. Got you, was what that quivering meant. Got you. There was no blood, not yet. The claws had cut cleanly through skin, muscle, fatty tissue, stomach, liver, and pancreas. But the pain was excruciating. Chief Molyneux remembered reading that seppuku was the most agonizing death of all, and now he knew why. He grasped 2 of the horny claws, but they were too sharp for him to tug free. They would have cut off his fingers, and the creature that had impaled him was far too strong for him to push away. He felt chilly breath on the back of his neck, breath that smelled like refrigerated bodies in the city morgue, and he knew that he was going to die. "Mother," he whispered, and at that moment, Mary the Virgin and Maureen Molyneux, his own mother, became inextricably entangled in his mind, both of them calm and quiet, both of them holy in their own particular way. He felt the creature convulse, and then its claws were dragged inexorably downward, slicing through muscle and bone and intestine until they cut into his pelvic bone and stuck. "Ah!" he screamed. "Ah! God! God! God!" Then he dropped to his knees in the orphanage garden, praying that the creature would keep its claws buried in his body until he died, because he simply wouldn't be able to stand the pain of it taking them out. But it did just that. Slowly, inch by inch, claw sliding through flesh, bone sliding against nerve, while Chief Molyneux wept like a child and ground his forehead against the concrete path and pleaded for nothing but oblivion. The shadow stood over him for 2 or 3 moments more. Then it swirled away, leaving behind it a deep bone coldness, as cold as a monastery floor, and a thin odor of incense and bile and death. Chapter 16. John opened his eyes. Diane was standing beside the bed, shaking his shoulder. He frowned at her, then looked toward the window. It was still dark outside. "What time is it?" he asked. 3:30. I saw kind of a flicker and guessed you were back. John said immediately, "We messed it up. Total snafu. There were more shadow creatures, small ones, less developed, and we decided to deal with them first. And? Well, we managed it. We killed them all. But the big one got away. Maybe it got into the real world again. Maybe it didn't. We don't know yet." Diane said, "I have some pictures. The quality isn't too hot, because I don't think you were concentrating, except toward the end, maybe." "Let me take a look," John said. "We went into that garden again. You know, the garden with the statues and the tombs and the dried-up weeds. Those are the best pictures of all," Diane told him. "Here, take a look." She held up 9 or 10 blurry computer printouts of the dream in which John had so recently been running. John squinted his eyes, trying to pick out recognizable landmarks, statues that he recognized, pathways that looked familiar. "Can you have these pictures enhanced?" he asked. She gave him a grim smile. "These are enhanced." "Oh, sorry, it's just that they're so darn foggy." "John, this is a miracle. We're printing out imaginary images from the human brain. What do you want, Eve Arnold?" John stared for a very long time at the blurred picture of the sepulchre. He could just make out the letters Ye, Va, Sh, although he wouldn't have been able to decipher them if he hadn't seen them clear and sharp in Lenny's dream. He made Diane hold the picture up for so long that her hand began to tremble. "I don't know," John told her. "It looks familiar somehow, but I can't think why." "Maybe you ought to show it to Lenny." "Yes, maybe you're right. That is, if they'll let me anywhere near him." "What are you going to do about the shadow creature?" asked Diane. "You won't be able to go back tonight, will you? You're having your operation today. You'll still be under anesthetic." No, said John. "I'll have to postpone it. I have to kill that creature if it's the very last thing I do." Diane nodded. "I understand. Do you want me to talk to Dr. Freitag for you?" "Don't worry. I'll talk to him myself. Meanwhile, listen, maybe the best thing to do is for you to take these pictures to Lenny yourself. Maybe you can jog his memory." With brisk efficiency, Diane collected her pictures and collated them. "Later on today, I want you to go through all of these prints and describe them for me. Most of them are pretty dark." John said, "I could use a cup of coffee. You wouldn't call Sister Teresa, would you?" "Sure thing," said Diane, and reached for the telephone. As she did so, however, it rang. "How about that for a coincidence?" she said, and picked it up. She listened for a moment, then said, "I see. Yes, I see." She paused. "Oh, God, that's tragic. It really is. When?" "Okay, yes. Let me pass you over to John." John asked, "Who is it? What's going on?" But Diane shook her head and tucked the receiver firmly between his ear and the pillow. "Yes," he said. "Who is this?" "John, this is Thaddeus. Listen, John, I have some pretty bad news." "Not Lenny." "Lenny's okay. It's Brian Molyneux." "Chief Molyneux? What happened? Is he hurt?" "He's dead, John. It seems he went to visit Lenny at the Oddfellows Orphans' Home after he left headquarters. He checked Lenny's room and found that the window was open. The patrol man on duty said he went off to check out the gardens, and that was the last he saw of the chief. They found his body ripped open, chest to pelvis. Didn't stand a chance, according to the M.E. John swallowed. "We failed him, didn't we? He had a pretty good idea of what we were trying to do, and we failed him." "John," Thaddeus said, "Brian always knew the risks." "Did he have family?" "Wife, 3 grown-up kids." "Oh, shit," said John in anguish. Thaddeus paused for a moment. Then he said, "We're all cut up about it, John, believe me. But you and me and the rest of the Night Warriors, we've got a more immediate problem, and that is, what's going to happen to Lenny?" They had to wake the commissioner, and believe me, the commissioner doesn't like being woken up whatever. And the police department has located a letter that Chief Molyneux left behind in case anything happened. "A letter?" asked John. "Well, I don't know exactly what it says," Thaddeus admitted, "but it seems Chief Molyneux truly believed that Lenny was possessed by some kind of supernatural spirit. Like he was a Sherlock Holmes buff, you know? Once you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And Chief Molyneux was definitely coming around to thinking that the shadow creature was the truth. It was inevitable, I guess. He was a good detective. The commissioner won't go along with that, though, will he? I don't know. He and Brian went way back together, right back to police academy.
Thaddeus, you're trying to tell me something.
What else did Chief Molyneux write in this letter of his? Well, I hate to say this, but he suggested that the only option left to the police department might be to knock Lenny off, you know? In the hope that the spirit would be forced to check out at the same time.
John bit his lip. He was shaking with suppressed anxiety.
Thaddeus said, "I'm sorry, John, but that's what he wrote. Something like, how do you get rid of poison? You break the bottle."
I knew it, John told him. I damned well knew it. But the commissioner doesn't believe in the supernatural, does he? He's not going to have Lenny killed on the basis of an uncorroborated letter from Chief Molyneux, surely.
Thaddeus sniffed. You don't know the commissioner. The commissioner likes a quiet life, no crime, no problems. He likes clock golf and rice pudding. If he's faced with a choice between Lenny's life and 365 gory and well-publicized homicides per year, then, boy, he's not going to see that he has much in the way of alternative options.
John took a deep breath. Do you have any idea what's going to happen to Lenny now?
They've taken him down to police headquarters for questioning. That's all I know.
All right, Thaddeus, John told him. Thanks for calling. Let me see if I can get to talk to Lenny. Then I'll get straight back to you. Better still, why don't you come around to the hospital, say 11 o'clock?
We'll be there,
Thaddeus promised. Diane lifted the receiver away from John's cheek. John looked at her and didn't know what to say. What are you going to do now? She asked. I'm not entirely sure yet, John said. I'm calling my lawyers, and I'm calling the Philadelphia News. If anybody so much as lays one finger on Lenny, he wasn't responsible for killing any of those people. You know it, and I know it. Diane leaned over the bed and kissed him. This is all going to work out, she reassured him. John closed his eyes and thought about the collapsing school building and Mr. Eisenberg and the strange cemetery-like garden to which Lenny's dreams mesmerically returned time after time. If you say so, he said. I'm beginning to think that this shadow creature is giving us the goddamned runaround. Softly but forcefully, Diane pressed a finger to John's lips. Don't lose your cool, okay? Lenny's counting on you. So am I. So are all the rest of the Night Warriors. All right, John replied. All right. I'm sorry. But see if you can get those dream photographs around to Lenny, will you? Even if he doesn't recognize them at all, well, at least we'll know that we're barking up the wrong tree. Diane kissed him again. I'll find a way to see Lenny, she said. Don't worry. I'll call you as soon as I do. John found his mouth tightening. Tears squeezed out of the corner of his eyes. Tell him I love him, he told her. And tell him he's not to blame. She brushed his tears away with soft fingertips. You liked him, didn't you, Chief Molyneux? Liked him? John retorted. Hell no. Liked him? No. But at least he believed us. Lenny was standing by the window at the far end of the waiting room when Diane came in to see him. Lieutenant Flexner, Jewish, paunchy and 40-ish, with a heavy black mustache, thrust his thumbs into his belt and said, Go ahead. There he is, ma'am. And don't worry, he don't bite. Diane approached Lenny across the room. Lenny didn't even turn his head. He looked pale and tired, and his eyes were fixed dully on the rooftops across the street, where washing hung limply and pigeons strutted in cages, and two men sat smoking pipes and talking, all under the heat haze of midsummer Philadelphia.
Diane sat on the arm of a sagging sofa, her orange envelope of dream prints held close to her chest. She smiled at Lenny, and at last he looked around and stared at her.
Hi, Lenny. How are you?
He didn't show any sign that he recognized her.
I'm fine, thanks. Do you remember me? She asked him. Diane Wesley? From the university?
He nodded.
That time the nun got killed.
She reached out and touched his hand.
That's right. Sister Perpetua.
She paused for a while, watching him, then said,
I saw your daddy this morning at the hospital. He sends his love. Tell that champ he's the bestest. That's what he said.
Lenny glanced at her. It was plain from the brightness in his eyes that he believed her.
And you know what else he said? Diane went on. He said, ask the champ to take a look at these pictures for me. Tell me if there's anything he recognizes.
She held up the envelope.
Will you do that for me?
Lenny shuffled his sneakers.
I guess.
Over by the door, Lieutenant Flexner snuffled and cleared his throat, and when Diane turned around, he gave her a flirtatious little finger wave. She smiled back, a professional, efficient mask. Diane and Lenny sat down on the sofa, and Diane passed him one by one the dream photographs that she had taken the previous night. Lenny studied them carefully, but it was obvious that he remembered very little of what he had been dreaming about.
That looks like my schoolyard, but it's kind of different. I don't know. The school isn't as big as that. And that's the hall.
He peered intently.
That's my classroom. I think that's my classroom. What are all those black shadows sitting at the desks?
Diane said gently,
You dreamed this, Lenny, last night. This is a picture of your dream.
Lenny shook his head.
I don't remember it at all.
Well, that's not surprising. We dream for most of the night, but we don't usually remember what we dreamed about. I'm just trying to find out if any of these pictures jog your memory. She watched Lenny as he leafed through picture after picture. At last he stopped and examined one of them more intently.
This. I know where this one is.
Diane took the picture and held it up. The garden, the sepulchre, black sky, shriveled grass. She told Lenny, Your daddy told me that he thinks this place is very important for some reason. He has the feeling that if we can find out where this place is, we might be able to destroy the shadow thing that keeps coming out of your mind.
It's not a real place, Lenny told her. It's in my scripture book.
You mean it's a picture?
Lenny nodded. It's in my scripture book at school.
Diane leaned over and gathered up her prints.
Lenny, she said, you're an angel. I used to look at it after Mommy died, and I used to think that she was buried there.
Diane said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do now, Lenny. I'm going to go to your school and find that book. I think that it can help us a lot. And there's one thing that your daddy and I want you to do. It's going to be hard, but we want you to try. We want you to stay awake tonight for as long as you possibly can. Until midnight, at least. In fact, I have some pills here. No, don't let that detective see you. But if you really feel that you can't keep your eyes open any longer, take one of these. Lenny took the paper twist with 3 Benzedrine tablets in it and tucked it into his jeans pocket. Poor kid, thought Diane. He looks exhausted already. But if he falls asleep too early tonight and another policeman dies... Diane left police headquarters and drove to the Benjamin Franklin Grade School on 16th Street. She parked in the same parking lot in which the night warriors had materialized last night and walked across the playground. The swing set that had become a nightmare puzzle of twisted metal was crowded with laughing, shouting children, all swinging like monkeys. Diane went in through the double doors to the hallway and asked a small, serious-faced girl with pigtails if she could direct her to the principal's office. At that moment, however, a thin-faced man in a grey summer suit appeared, taking off his gold-rimmed spectacles as he approached her. "Anthony Eisenberg," he said. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Diane smiled. "I hope you can. I'm a friend of the Woods family. You know, Lenny Woods?" "Oh, poor Lenny," said Mr. Eisenberg. "Believe me, our hearts have really gone out to that young fellow." "He's over at police headquarters now," Diane told him, "and I was wondering if it would be possible for him to have his scripture book. He really feels the need for some words of comfort." "But of course," said Mr. Eisenberg. "I should imagine that all of his books are still in his locker. Why don't you come upstairs and take a look?" Diane followed Mr. Eisenberg up the wide staircase. At the head of the staircase, there was a tall window of yellowish hammered glass, protected by fine steel mesh. It cast a strange light into the building, as if they were walking around inside a sepia photograph of days gone by. Lenny's locker stood just outside his classroom. Mr. Eisenberg opened it and said, "Help yourself, and please, when you take him that book, take him our very best wishes, too, won't you?" "Believe me, I will," said Diane. Mr. Eisenberg left her, and she hurriedly sorted through Lenny's schoolbooks. Junior Mathematics, Part 1, Grade School English, A Shorter History of the United States of America. Then she found it, a slim, well-worn book with a dark maroon cover, an introduction to the Scriptures. She opened it and leafed through it. She found the page easily, because Lenny must have turned to it time and time again, seeking some kind of understanding of where his mommy had gone and why she had left him. The picture was in black and white, a black six-paneled door opening onto a bleak and broken garden. In the center of the garden stood a marble sepulchre on which was engraved the words, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Above those words, in blue ballpoint pen, Lenny had written the word, "Mom." In his dreams, the sepulchre had broken open. That was why half of the lettering had been missing. "Mom, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." The picture was an allegory of the fear of death, and it was more than likely that Lenny's overwhelming fear of death had aroused the embryonic shadow creature as it nestled in the wall of his house. There was something else, though. Underneath the picture, the full verse was printed, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." And it was there. Somehow the answer was there. Diane closed the book and held it in front of her as if it were a holy missal. "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." She closed Lenny's locker and left the school. The day was still unbearably hot. The sky was the color of oxidized bronze, and the heat haze made everything look blurry, as if the whole world were out of focus. She drove out of the parking lot and headed over to the hospital to tell John what she had found. Dr. Freitag stood at the end of John's bed and noisily popped his knuckles one by one. "Mr. Woods, John, there is no reason at all for you to delay this operation. In fact, the sooner you have it, the better. You could suffer permanent impairment if you leave it very much longer. You know what I mean by impairment." John said, "You can't change my mind. I'm sorry. You understand that your insurance may not cover the cost of cancelled theater time, especially if there's no good reason for it." "Dr. Freitag, I thought that I'd made myself plain. Cost doesn't enter into it. I do not wish to have my operation today, and I may not wish to have my operation tomorrow.
It all depends."
Dr. Freitag blew out his cheeks. "Are you frightened? Is that it? Maybe you'd like some preoperative counseling. I mean, that can be arranged. We do have patients who can't stand the thought of being opened up. I mean, not that we're going to be opening you up very much. This particular operation is comparatively superficial in terms of how far we're going to go in." John closed his eyes. "Dr. Freitag, I respect your professional status. I apologize to you and all of your team for any inconvenience and possible loss of earnings. But I'm not going to have my operation today, and that's all there is to it. Period." Dr. Freitag went to the window and stared out at the hazy Philadelphia skyline. "You know something? When I was in med school, they told me that the success of any operation was cooperation. That's what they said. The patient and the surgeon, both working together toward the same end." He turned back to John. "For that reason, I have to say, okay, let's postpone it. I can't possibly be ready till you're ready. But believe me, 24 people are going to be very pissed about this, including me." John said, "Let me tell you this, Dr. Freitag. When I'm prepared to have this operation, I'll tell you why I'm taking a rain check. You got me? I'll tell you the whole story." "But you can't tell me now?" John shook his head. "No, I'm sorry." "He's sorry," said Dr. Freitag to nobody at all. Just then, there was a knock at the door, and Toussaint wheeled himself in. "Hi, Dr. Freitag." "Hi, John. Are you coming on out? The Clays are here. So's the whole gang." "Sure," said John. "Maybe Dr. Freitag can help me into my wheelchair." Dr. Freitag said nothing, but assisted John to roll off his bed and into his wheelchair. "You know something?" John said. "The first time I tried this, I fell flat on the floor." Grimacing, tugging his three-piece suit straight, Dr. Freitag said, "I hope that wasn't too uncomfortable." "It's always uncomfortable," John replied, "but sometimes less uncomfortable than others. You, Dr. Freitag, you were even more gentle with me than Sister Claire." "So, what do we do?" Dr. Freitag demanded. "Postpone this operation sine die?" "I don't have any choice," John told him. "I have more important things to take care of." "There's something more important than being totally paralyzed?" John looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, doctor, there is." "This man has hidden depths," Toussaint put in. Dr. Freitag turned and stared at Toussaint with bulging eyes. "I wouldn't mind knowing what the hell is going on around here," he snapped. "There, that is our secret. Go to sleep. You will wake and remember and understand," Toussaint quoted. Then he smiled at Dr. Freitag and said, "Browning, the poet, not the rifle maker." "Toussaint," said Dr. Freitag, "you read too much." He left, closing the door not loudly, but with firm disapproval. Toussaint wheeled himself close to John's bed and sat looking at him for a while, saying nothing. "We going out again tonight?" he asked after a while. "You bet," John told him. "And this time we're going to zap that shadow creature for good?" "We have to. Otherwise somebody else is going to die, and maybe Lenny will, too. I can't protect him from the police department. Not forever." Toussaint reached out and grasped John's shoulder. "I guess this sounds pretty stupid, pretty sentimental, but I want you to know that being a night warrior, that's the very best thing that ever happened to me, ever. And if I never walk again, if I never move from this wheelchair, I'm still going to know that my life was worthwhile, because I walked in dreams, and I fought demons in dreams, and I was a night warrior."
John nodded. You're the best, Toussaint, and nobody can ever take that away from you. Ever. At that moment, the door opened, and Diane came in, looking flushed and excited and more desirable than ever. She was holding up Lenny's maroon scripture book.
John, I found it. I found the garden, and what the letters mean. Here, take a look.
She held the book open for John to look at. When he saw the door and the garden and the sepulchre, he felt a tingling around his shoulders, and his mouth went dry. That's it. That's exactly it. That's the place in the dream. Toussaint, you recognize that, don't you? You were there. Toussaint squinted at it, nodded, and said,
Sure thing. That's the place. Looks like my uncle's backyard in Camden.
Diane said,
John, you had a feeling, didn't you, that the answer was here? And I agree with you. I think that it is. It all fits into place. The shadow creature is the fear of death, the actual physical fear of death. And when Lenny moved into your house on 3rd Street, his strong feelings of fear woke up that shadow creature in the wall. The shadow creature must have felt that it was being called, almost. That's how strong Lenny's fear of death was. He was frightened of what had happened to Virginia, and he was frightened that it might unexpectedly happen to you or to Jennifer, or worst of all, to him. A child of that age doesn't watch his mother choke to death and remain unscathed. It isn't possible. It isn't human.
But how does that help us to exterminate this creature? John asked her.
I'm not sure, but Delegate Rufus King of Massachusetts knew how to do it back in 1787, and so did Gouverneur Morris.
John stared at the picture. He felt that he had discovered at last the shining road that he had been seeking for days, only to find that it amounted to very little more than a dead end.
Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he whispered.
Then he read the verse underneath.
Thy rod and thy staff. Thy staff? What is it?
Asked Diane.
What?
John said, Thaddeus and Norman. Are they anywhere around?
Well, sure they are, said Toussaint. That's what I came in to tell you. They're out in the yard with Jehu and Dean and Billy. They were expecting you to come out and join them.
Wheel me out there, John asked Diane. Quick, wheel me out there.
Anything you say, General Patton, said Diane.
She wheeled him out of the room and along the corridor to the garden. After the 65-degree air conditioning inside the hospital building, the brick-paved yard was oppressively hot. But John didn't care. Diane pushed him all the way across to the cedar tree where Thaddeus and Norman were talking to their fellow night warriors. Show them the book, John told Diane, without any preliminary greeting. Mean Dean took the book, peered at it, and then passed it around. Recognize it? Asked John. They all nodded.
That weedy old garden, right? Asked Billy. The one with the naked statues with no arms and no heads, and that broken-down bandstand.
Sepulchre, John corrected him. Bandstand, Dean teased Billy. Friggin' A. Diane passed the book to Thaddeus. In silence, Thaddeus studied it. Then he looked up at John and said, I'm sorry, but so what? What does this prove?
Read what it says underneath.
Thaddeus hesitated, and then he read, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me.
Go on,
John urged. Thaddeus frowned. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. He closed the book. He looked at John in perplexity.
Don't you remember all that research you did into Rufus King? And how he went around to Nathan Grant's house and started a great commotion?
Sure, yes, but
don't you remember what you said? King went round to the Grant house with his staff.
Well, sure, but I kind of assumed that meant the people who worked for him. Or maybe the night warriors that he managed to rustle up in Massachusetts. John said, "How many staff do you think that a delegate like Rufus King would have taken with him to Philadelphia in 1787? Maybe a manservant to take care of his clothes, a secretary possibly, but no more than that. And I can't imagine that he would have asked either of them to help him exorcise the house of Nathan Grant."
"Maybe it means the night warriors,"
put in Che-U. "Well, that's one explanation," said John. "But he wouldn't have taken them with him, would he? Night warriors operate in dreams, invisibly, and nobody would have known that he took them with him. Besides, nobody would have called the night warriors his staff." "But staff doesn't mean anything except stick," put in Dean. "Maybe it means that he took his stick. They all used to carry them in those days. I mean, they were historical, right? They were probably afraid of falling over. Or maybe he wanted to hit this guy Nathan Grant over the head."
"Dean, for Christ's sake," John protested. "He took his staff, his holy staff, the same staff that they talk about in Psalm 23. And that's what can overcome the fear of death."
There was a very long silence. Then Che-U said,
"John, what you are trying to say, it may mean nothing at all. To be frank, it may all be horseshit. But, on the other hand, it may enable us to conquer the shadow creature forever."
"Yes," said John.
"So where do we find ourselves this holy staff?" Billy wanted to know. "It's not exactly the kind of item you keep falling over in your average pawnbrokers, right?"
"That's why I wanted to talk to Thaddeus and Norman today," said John. "I want them to go back to the library and see if they can dig up anything at all, about Rufus King and a holy staff." "You think that's going to be time well spent?" asked Thaddeus. "Well, do you have any better ideas?" John challenged. Thaddeus shrugged. "Guess I don't. Come on, Norman." John said, "Thaddeus, Norman, I'm playing a hunch here. Not much more, but we're running out of time." "All right, man." Thaddeus nodded, not smiling. "We'll do what we can." "There's one more thing," said John. "All those years ago, Rufus King went around to Nathan Grant's house in person. He wasn't dressed as a night warrior, not as a dream personality, but in the flesh. I believe that he had already arranged for the night warriors to chase the shadow creature out of Nathan Grant's dreams, the idea being that when the shadow creature manifested itself in the waking world, it could be ambushed and killed. So, when it shifts from the dream world to the real world, it could be vulnerable then?" Thaddeus asked. "I think so. It must suffer some pretty heavy psychic stress, and maybe that's the right moment to hit it." Dean snapped his fingers. "That's great, then. We've cracked it. All we need is a holy staff." "Shut up, Dean," said Thaddeus. "John, Diane, you take care. We'll be back from the library just as soon as we can." "Hasta luego," said Dean, without any optimism at all. Just before 4 o'clock that afternoon, exhausted, John fell asleep. In his room at the Philadelphia Police Headquarters, Lenny remained doggedly awake, reading heaps of old National Geographic magazines and watching television. Outside the window, the day began to darken. Electrical storms were forecast from New York to Charleston. The atmosphere was thick and hot and cheesy, and flies buzzed fitfully against the windows. In the Pennsylvania University Library, Thaddeus and Norman Clay sat at a table in the corner with more than 30 books spread out in front of them, flicking pages, searching for any records of Governor Morris or Rufus King, or the staff that King had taken to Nathan Grant's house the night of the Great Commotion. The Clay twins were beyond exhaustion now. Their closeness kept them going. When one of them stretched or yawned or showed signs of flagging, the other would glance at him sharply and say, "Come on, man, we have to find this thing." And they would bend their heads to their studies. Diane Wesley was sitting in a large basket-work chair in a first-floor apartment on 2nd Street, holding a huge glass of cake bread white, her eyes closed, listening to Suzanne Vega on the stereo. She was being watched by a thin, dark-haired man with hollow cheeks covered by a day's growth of stubble and eyebrows that knit in the middle. This was Seth Maxwell, from the biology department of the University of Pennsylvania, who had devoted so much time and so many of the university's specialized research facilities to tracking down the history of the shadow creature for her. "You staying tonight?" he asked her. "You want to have dinner?" Without opening her eyes, she said, "I don't think so, Seth. Tonight's the big night." "The big night? For who? You still haven't told me." She hesitated for a moment, then opened one eye. "The big night, that's all." Seth got up and walked across and stood over her. His pale green silk shirt was open down to the 4th button, revealing a narrow chest patterned with dark black hairs. "I thought we had something between us. Maybe I was wrong." "I used you, Seth. You know that." He grunted in amusement. "Knowing it doesn't make it any more acceptable. Besides, I still want to take you to dinner." "What you really mean is, you want to take me to dinner, and then you want to take me to bed. Look at the size of this glass of wine. There are only 2 reasons for a man giving a woman a glass of wine this big. Either he hates the wine and wants to get rid of it, or else he wants to get the woman drunk and into the sack." Seth laughed, but without much humor. "I don't know. In 3 days you give a woman the whole fruits of your life's work. All that stuff on shadow creatures. Do you realize what a paper that's going to make? And not just a paper, a book. The evolution of psychic DNA in the Quaternary period of the Cenozoic era by Professor Seth Maxwell. That stuff's going to make me famous. And I gave it all to you for nothing." Diane smiled. "You're a brick, Seth. They don't make bricks anymore." "A brick? Jesus!" He knelt down beside her. "Don't tell me you're hooked on this quadriplegic friend of yours." "He wasn't always quadriplegic." "What difference does that make?" "It doesn't make any difference at all. But I like him. He's suffered a lot. He feels a lot. But he still manages to keep his head together. God knows how. And he loves that son of his. You wouldn't even believe how much he loves that son of his." Seth stroked Diane's hand, then lifted it up and kissed it. "Change your mind," he told her. "Have dinner with me." "I've booked a table for 2 at Bookbinder's." "Seth, I can't. Not tonight. Not until everything's settled." Seth jerked his hand through his bushy black hair. "Settled? What's to settle? We've been working together on some creature that dates from 25 million years ago. 25 million years, Diane. That's more than 12 times longer than man has been walking on this planet. And you can't have dinner tonight?" Diane reached out and took hold of his wrist and squeezed it. "That's right, Seth. I can't have dinner tonight." Across town, Lenny was finding it hard to focus on a group of dancing Ashanti women in the National Geographic. He yawned and shook his head, trying to stay awake. But the room was airless, and the flies buzzed so monotonously, and he was so tired that it was almost impossible for him to keep his eyes open. In their separate rooms at the hospital, the night warriors waited for darkness. Toussaint picked at his acoustic guitar, playing a complicated version of When the Levee Breaks. Che-Yu was writing in his diary quick Chinese characters on thin onion skin paper. Billy was drinking Coors Light out of the can and watching Falcon crest. Mean Dean was out in the yard working with weights to develop his arm muscles, sweating in the humid, thunderous heat, his stringy cigarette dangling between his lips. Somebody else was waiting for this night. By a silvery grey sea, on a silvery grey beach, Kazix sat with his forehead resting on his knees. Since he had discharged all of his energy trying to save an imaginary girl called Catherine, he had spent day after day by this soulless beach, under a soulless sky. Only the nights had come alive, rampant with storms and volcanoes and cities that had grown out of nowhere at all. He had set out each night to search for other night warriors, through streets busy with giant toy cars, in and out of huge buildings, but so far he had come across nobody real. Only dream people, obliging but insubstantial. He had talked once to Sunny Jim, a living Sunny Jim, complete with monocle and pigtail and bright red cutaway coat. The same night he had come across the crew of the Starship Enterprise, although he hadn't recognized them at first, because he had never watched Star Trek, and, after meeting the crew of the Enterprise as dreamed by Lenny, he wasn't going to start watching it either. He was a professor of philosophy, and he had reconciled himself to the fact that he probably would never be able to return to the waking world. His real body, which was lying comatose in his beach house in Del Mar, would die of dehydration within a week. Then his soul would remain irrevocably trapped in Lenny's dream world until Lenny himself died. And then Kazix's soul would wink out with it, like an oil lamp pinched into extinction. He sat with his forehead resting on his knees, while the silvery grey sea silently coursed across the beach, and waited for the night to bring him more dreams. John opened his eyes. Thaddeus and Norman were standing beside his bed. They looked serious, both of them. Almost too serious.
"What's wrong?" he said hoarsely. "What have you found out?"
Thaddeus said, "We spent 4 hours at the university library. We found out more about Rufus King than anybody has a right to know."
"And?"
"Here, man," said Thaddeus, and helped John to prop up his head on the pillow.
"I'm fine," John insisted. "What did you find out?"
Thaddeus said, "We found out that Rufus King had a good friend in Salem, Massachusetts, a man called David Barlow, who was the owner of a shipping line, spices from the Orient, that kind of trade. And we also found out that David Barlow was the owner of a shepherd's crook that was supposed to have belonged to Moses, and which Moses had used as a walking stick during the Exodus from Egypt."
"Go on,"
John urged him. Thaddeus said, "This is all very sketchy, but it seems David Barlow's grandfather, Josiah Barlow, had bought the stick in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, at the time of the Salem witch trials. His intention was to bring it back to Salem to exorcise the devilry that was going on there. It seems he paid a whole lot of money for it, nearly $2,000 worth of gold. Big deal in those days."
"And did he get his money's worth?"
asked John. "Well, it seems so. As soon as he brought it back to Salem, the witch trial hysteria collapsed, and the whole business came to an end." John said nothing, but waited for Thaddeus to continue. Thaddeus said, "That shepherd's crook, that stick, that staff, well, it was kept at the Barlow family home right up until 1787. Then Rufus King came and took it, and brought it here to Philadelphia. According to the Barlow family records, nobody knew why, but whatever he brought it here for, it stayed here, and eventually it was given to the American Philosophical Society on 5th Street, who kept it in their library. and then it was passed to the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, whose curators didn't really believe it was authentic, so they stored it in their cellars on Broad Street.
What happened to it then? Asked John.
Thaddeus looked glum. Two suspended police detectives of mixed racial origin arrived at the Conservation Center and asked to see the said shepherd's crook, stick, or staff. And the gullible curators allowed them to take it away on loan. Norman, with a suddenly breaking smile, lifted in his right hand a dark staff of polished wood with a slightly curving top. Wood from an olive tree, but centuries old, weathered and battered and polished by the touch of countless human hands. The shepherd's crook, on which an aging Moses was supposed to have leaned as he led the children of Israel out of Egypt into the Promised Land. Thy rod, thy staff. John stared at it as Norman brought it closer. He couldn't reach out to touch it. He didn't have the power, but he could feel its magnetism. Tears sprang into his eyes. "You found it, you bastards! You actually found it!" "We're detectives," said Thaddeus smugly.
"Do you think it's going to work?"
asked John. "Who knows? We're not exactly sure what Rufus King did, but your guess was probably right. He used night warriors to flush the shadow creature out of Nathan Grant's dreams. Then, when it took on physical form, he used this stick to zap it for good." John's eyes ran from one end of the ancient stick to the other. "God Almighty, I hope it works."
Chapter 17. The night warriors assembled late that night at the house on Wissahinnok Avenue, and their mood was unusually grave. Springer was pale and androgynous, neither man nor woman, and dressed in a strange white, gauzy suit that was reminiscent of the Arabian Nights. "We pray that this plan of attack will at last succeed in destroying the shadow creature," said Springer. "Are you all well prepared?"
"Third time lucky," sniffed Themesteroth.
Exii said, "We should remember that Reblax has set aside his own interests tonight in order to exterminate the shadow creature, and all of us should try to equal his devotion." "I'll second that," put in Lyric. Archistrax said, "Supposing Diane can't smuggle that staff into police headquarters, what's the plan of action then?" Oramas I raised his hand reassuringly. "I arranged with Lieutenant Flexner that she should be allowed unrestricted access to Lenny for the purpose of completing her psychological tests. She carried the staff into the building in the tripod case for her video recording equipment. The staff will be there when we need it." Reblax said, "This whole thing is going to need nerve and concentration and perfect timing. We corner the shadow creature wherever we locate it. We keep hounding it until it takes the opportunity to leave the dream and materialize in the real world. We'll know when it's about to do that because Lenny will be dreaming about the garden in his scripture book. That's the time when Lenny's fear of death is at its strongest, and it's my belief that his fear gives the shadow creature the extra strength it requires to take on material shape. The instant the shadow creature disappears, Oramas I will take me and Themesteroth back into the waking world. The rest of you will stay in the dream, in case the shadow creature tries to escape back into Lenny's imagination. Don't ask me how we're going to use the staff to destroy the shadow creature, because I don't know. But from what happened at the Grant House that night in 1787, it seems that it has some powers of its own, if you believe in it enough."
"Sure," retorted Themesteroth, "and maybe it doesn't."
"Well," said Reblax, "tonight we're going to find out for sure." They knelt together and spoke the sacred incantation of Ashapola.
Tonight, however, Springer spread his arms and asked an additional blessing: that they all return safe from what Edgar Allan Poe had called that wild, weird climb of dreams. He had just finished his prayer when there was a loud pounding at the front door of the house, and a floodlight penetrated the room from the street below.
"What the hell?"
Themesteroth demanded, and went to the window.
"Police!" an amplified voice boomed out. "You're under arrest! Come out of the house with your hands held high!"
Reblax joined Themesteroth at the window. There were 4 patrol cars parked at all angles in the avenue, with armed police kneeling behind them. Across the street, he could make out 2 detectives and a man in a green golfing shirt, holding a dog on a lead. "Time to leave, I think," said Springer. The night warriors stood in a circle, closed their eyes, and floated through the molecules of the roof and into the humid night. They circled high above the house, and as they did so, they saw the police dodging and darting through the yard. One of the cops took a sledgehammer to the front door, while 3 of his colleagues kept him covered. Reblax smiled to himself as he turned toward downtown Philadelphia. He saw the patrolmen's flashlights crisscrossing the upstairs room, searching for what? Anarchists? Dope addicts? Terrorists? Ghosts? All they would find would be dust and dereliction, and the stale odor of a house in which nobody human had lived for 30 years. The night warriors floated darkly through the sky, over the glittering, criss-crossed streets of Philadelphia, at last approaching police headquarters like bats, or shadows of shadows. They followed Oromas 1 and Oromas 2 through the concrete roof and down through floor after floor of darkened offices and corridors until they arrived at last in the basement security area. In a grey-painted room with no furniture except a bed, a bedside locker, and a folding chair, Lenny lay sleeping. Diane was there too, with her video equipment set up, watching him. She was wearing a sand-coloured safari suit, and her hair was tied up in a turban. Reblax thought that she looked stunning. They assembled around her, and although they were ghost-like and insubstantial, she was aware of their arrival. They appeared to her as distortions in the air, similar to heat ripples rising off a summer sidewalk, and she was conscious of their voices as an almost imperceptible vibration. Reblax pointed to the staff of Moses, which Diane had left propped in the corner of the room, beside the bed. Archistrax said,
"Diane knows how dangerous this is. I mean, she's going to be first in line for a slashing, if we don't zap that critter like instantly."
"She knows," Reblax told him. "I tried to talk her out of this, but she wouldn't hear of it."
"All right, then. Let's do it," said Themesteroth.
And Oromas 1 and Oromas 2 drew their glowing blue octagons in the air, their twin gateways to Lenny's dreams. Reblax nervously cleared his throat. He prayed that Lenny's dream wouldn't be too bizarre, and that the landscape wouldn't prove too difficult for them to track down the shadow creature quickly. Oromas 1 and Oromas 2 parted the air in front of them and revealed the huge interior of a brightly lit Byzantine building, tiled in peacock and gold. But as they pulled the octagons down to the floor and the night warriors stepped into Lenny's sleeping imagination, they all realized that this was more than an ordinary dream about a grand, church-like building. The entire structure was lying on its side, with its elaborately tiled floor rising up to their left, and the Moorish arches of its ceiling rising up to their right. They were actually standing on one of the walls, with a row of decorative windows stretched in front of them and sunlight slanting diagonally upward into the building's vast interior. Above their heads there were 2 rows of green marble pillars, stretching horizontally from one side of the building to the other. Higher still, in the ceiling, was another row of windows through which they could see clear violet sky. Reblax approached the first of the windows in the floor and cautiously looked down. He could see sky and Eastern-style rooftops and spires. But it was clear at once that not all the buildings were tilted the same way. Some were lying on their sides, others were upside down with their roofs against the ground. Reblax felt a deep surge of disorientation and nausea.
"What's going on here?" asked Themesteroth. "What the hell kind of a dream is this?"
"The whole damned world is lying on its side," said Archistrax.
Oramas I was already sweeping the building with his sensors. "It's close," he announced almost at once. "Very close. Very strong. I wouldn't be surprised if it's been waiting for us. Intense negative reading close to the building's main door."
"That's all very well," Lyrak protested. "But where is the main door?"
Archistrax lowered his screen in front of his helmet and scanned a holographic diagram of the building.
"Byzantine church, similar to St. Sophia in Istanbul."
He swiveled the diagram around so that the building appeared to be right way up.
"We're standing close to the ceiling on the south side of the church, about 24 meters above the altar. The main door is on the north side of the church, diametrically opposite us."
They looked up and to the left, and behind the double rows of marble pillars they could make out an archway, its door partially open. "That's it," said Oramas I. "That's where it's coming from. But how the Godfrey Daniels do we get up there?" Archistrax punched the buttons of his architectural theorizer.
"Okay. I can construct a temporary stairway up to the first row of pillars, then a bridge up to the second row of pillars, and finally a platform that will take us to door level. We're going to need a platform there, because if we step out of that doorway, we're simply going to fall straight down into the sky."
Themesteroth said, "Come on, then. Let's get going."
Oramas I adjusted his scanner. "It's there, the shadow creature, right by the door, just above the door." The huge building was shaken by a deep, rumbling sound. One window at a time, the rays of the sun died away, and a cold wind began to blow upward, tossing dead leaves into the vaulted interior. Reblax, stepping back to catch his balance, caught a glimpse of something black hanging over the edge of the door. Something black, like funeral robes. Something that stank of death. Archistrax checked the atmosphere for mineral content, anything that he could use to construct his stairways and bridges.
"Not enough," he decided. "Maybe the shadow creature's gotten wise."
But he immediately unhooked a handheld machine that looked like a heavyweight pastry wheel, and knelt down and began to cut slabs of stone out of the church walls. The wheel screeched through the stone at high speed, sending up clouds of gritty dust. But that dust was almost immediately swirled away by the gale-force winds. Within minutes, Archistrax had set up the beginnings of a finely balanced stone staircase, only 6 or 7 inches wide, which climbed toward the lower rank of pillars. He was still 10 feet away from reaching the pillars, however, when a small, dark shape detached itself from the doorway on the opposite side of the church and ran down the wall.
"Did you see that?" said Lyrak.
Reblax nodded. "It's sending something after us. Something that can walk on the floor." It was growing darker inside the church. Reblax listened and thought he heard a sharp scuffling sound, but it was impossible to distinguish anything clearly over the screeching of Archistrax's stone-cutting and the wind that shrieked in through the open windows. But then he saw a black shape down by the base of one of the pillars, a scrunched-up, scaly thing with claws and spines. It had the same shuddery effect on him as switching on the kitchen light and finding the sink teeming with cockroaches. "There," he told Lyrak, and Lyrak swung his music rifle around, tuned it up to a high-pitched hum, and aimed it close to the creature's hiding place. Immediately, the creature reappeared, and Lirac fired. With an ear-splitting chord, the creature burst apart into a shower of black fragments. But the fragments, instead of dropping sideways to the floor or down to the wall or wherever the night warriors might have expected them to drop, came hurtling toward them and lashed into them in a stinging shower of broken shell and bits of claw. One of the spines caught Archistrax across the cheek, and, with a wild squeal of metal against marble, he almost lost control of his stonecutter. Another piece stung Reblax across the shoulder and left a glutinous squiggle of thick yellow liquid across his faceplate. Now another cockroach thing appeared at the door and scurried across the floor of the church. Then another, and another, until the floor was thick with them. "How much longer with that damned staircase?" Oromas 1 shouted. "All we want is a bridge, not St. Patrick's Cathedral." Even before the echoes of his shouting had been blown away by the gusting gale, the air around the night warriors was stiff with flying insect spines, thousands of them. They rattled and cascaded against their armor, stuck into their legs and arms, and bristled out of their helmets. The cockroach things were lifting their claws and, with a sharp downward sweep, releasing scores of their own black spines. Exii activated 2 of his discs, hesitated for a moment while he mentally programmed them, then let them fly. Glowing brightly, they flashed away from his helmet and flew in tight formation up through the gloomy church, weaving in and out between the pillars. The cockroach things showered the discs with spines, but Exii had anticipated that. The discs oscillated furiously so that the spines were scattered in all directions. The discs swooped silently right to the upper quarter of the church, illuminating it for a moment with their rainbow brightness, and then, without hesitation, they came slashing down the left-hand wall in a perfect series of 6-shaped patterns, one after the other, at exactly the height of the cockroach things' heads. The church was filled with a hideous screaming sound as hundreds of insect heads dropped to the opposite wall in an unstoppable torrent, followed by shuddering, headless bodies. Within seconds, almost all of the cockroach things were heaped up on the wall, their limbs still twitching, their jaws still opening and closing, but undeniably dead.
"Way to go, Exii," said Lirac.
And now Archistrax's stone staircase was complete, its last step fitting with a snug grating sound up against the curved side of one of the horizontal pillars. The storm that was blowing in through the windows beneath their feet grew even fiercer, and it began to rain. The night warriors struggled to the foot of Archistrax's steps and started to climb. Themesteroth first, with his rockets already activated, followed by Oromas 2 and Lirac and Exii. Oromas 1 was about to climb up when the building started to vibrate once again, low, thunderous vibration that they could feel right through their teeth. Archistrax hesitated for a moment, and then he shouted, "Off the staircase! Off!" Without hesitating, the night warriors jumped from the staircase down to the floor. Themesteroth landed badly and lay on his side, winded. Lirac's music rifle clattered against the stone, one high-tension string snapping with an off-key "padoing." The building shook so violently that their vision was blurred, and massive lumps of masonry crashed down through the rows of pillars and bounced against the lower wall. Archistrax's miraculously constructed staircase toppled, and they were left with nothing but smashed fragments of stone. Up in the church doorway, Reblax saw the dark, flickering shape of the shadow creature. "He's getting away!" Oromas 1 shouted. "Themesteroth, hit him with a rocket!" Themesteroth tried to get up, but something must have been broken, because he fell back against the wall, grimacing underneath his faceplate. Oromas 2 knelt beside him, but there was no chance of him being able to fire a rocket without taking off Themesteroth's backpack and guidance equipment, and by then it would be far too late.
RMS-1, follow me! Yelled Reblax against the mounting screaming of the storm. He released the steel crescent from the palm of his hand and whipped the wire out faster and faster and longer until he was poised on the wall of the church with a whistling wire nearly 30 feet long held high above his head. Sfee, 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 sang the wire, and then Reblax flicked his wrist and the wire lashed itself tightly around one of the horizontal pillars above their heads. Reblax tugged it to test that it was tight, then braced his feet against the wall. "Up!" he shouted at Oramas-1. "If we don't get that creature now, it's going to slash Diane to pieces!" Oramas-1 didn't need to be told twice. He grasped the wire in one hand, clicked down 2 levers on his power grill, and rose smoothly up the wire until he reached the pillar. Straddling the pillar like a lumberjack straddling a fallen tree, he reached down and hauled Reblax up to join him. Reblax called down to the rest of the night warriors, "Wait here! If you see the shadow creature come back, hit it with everything you've got. Negative power, remember!" Oramas-2 waved to Reblax to show that he had understood. Then Reblax balanced on the pillar and spun the wire around his head again and lashed it around one of the second row of pillars, 30 feet above them. "Hold on to me," he told Oramas-1. Oramas-1 stood behind him and gripped him tightly around the waist. "I hope you know what you're doing," he breathed, his voice tinny inside his helmet. "Trying to save some lives," Reblax replied. The two of them hesitated for a moment, swaying on the rain-slick marble of the pillar. But then the building shook once again, and some of the pillars started to drop from their pedestals and shatter on the wall beneath them. Lightning flickered in through the windows, and they knew that it was now or never. "Ashapola!" shouted Reblax, and launched himself into the air, with Oramas-1 still clinging to his back. They swung like a pendulum beneath the pillar, and then, as they swung toward the church's main doors, Reblax released the catch that locked the wire to his wrist. The two of them hurtled through the open doors like tumblers in a circus. "Grab something!" Reblax yelled, snatching at the door handle. Oramas-1 reached out for the open door, but missed, and fell down the church's vertically angled steps and the mosaic courtyard in front of it, bouncing off a wall, rolling through an open gateway, and then plunging down a muddy street, trying to dig his fingers into the mud to slow himself down. Reblax, swinging precariously from the door handle, glanced upward and was just in time to see the black figure of the shadow creature disappearing up an alleyway. But there was nothing he could do without Oramas-1. Oramas-1 was his key to returning to the waking world. He swung twice more, then allowed himself to drop through the courtyard and fall through the gateway into the same muddy street. He rolled, slithered, bumped, and finished up colliding with a garden wall, where Oramas-1 had already come to rest. Winded but unhurt, he looked over the edge of the wall and saw plum trees that grew sideways out of the grass, and birds that flew vertically up and down. But the oddity of the garden was nothing compared with the stark, vertiginous terror of looking down and seeing nothing but empty sky and the sun burning like the core of a live volcano. "Are you all right?" Reblax asked Oramas-1. "Bruised, I guess, but otherwise okay." Reblax stood up on the wall, keeping one hand pressed against the muddy street to give him support. He hoped that the wall would hold their weight. "I saw the shadow creature go that-a-way," he said, pointing directly upward. "So, how are we going to get after him?" Oramas-1 wanted to know. "We can't possibly catch him if we have to climb every inch of the way. It's going to be like pushing peanuts up Mount Rushmore with our noses." But even as they spoke, the world around them began to change. The sun sank slowly below the horizon, and for a moment they were bathed in shafts of golden light that streamed upward through the branches of the trees.
Then, as the sky darkened and the stars prickled the sky, they felt the world begin to tilt beneath their feet. Oromas I looked up at the stars. They were wheeling in the sky like the stars in a planetarium.
"We're righting ourselves," he told Reblax. "This is a different dream."
Within a few minutes, Reblax and Oromas I found themselves standing in a small room. A room without windows or furniture. The only light came from the cracks around the door, which, to Reblax's relief, was set in the wall the right way up. He touched the depression on his helmet, and the room was lit up. It was white and completely featureless except for the door. The door was black, 6-panelled, with a decorative brass handle, the same door that had appeared in Lenny's scripture book.
"The garden," said Reblax urgently. "It's gone to the garden."
He tugged open the door, and there it lay, the darkened garden with its criss-cross paths and its broken statues. He and Oromas I stepped out onto the patio and down the steps, anxiously looking around for any sign of the shadow creature.
"God," thought Reblax, "if it's entered the real world already."
They hurried along the central pathway between stalks of bone-white bracken and dried-up heathers. Reblax was sure that the statues changed their positions, that they turned on their pedestals as he and Oromas I went hurrying by. Whichever way he and Oromas I went, they could never see the faces of any of the statues. They were always confronted by broken stone backs. At last, they reached the marble sepulchre. Their feet crunched on the weedy white gravel.
"Any sign of it?"
Oromas I panted. Reblax shook his head.
"God, Ashipola, whatever you are, I'm counting on you now. Keep Diane safe."
Oromas I said,
"It's still dark here, like there's still a feeling of fear. Can you sense it? Maybe the shadow creature's still lurking around."
"Well, let's keep checking," said Reblax. "You go round that side of the sepulchre, I'll go round this side. Then we'll meet up again and try those tombs over there."
"You got it,"
Oromas I agreed. Oromas I moved off to the left, while Reblax circled the sepulchre to the right. He trod as softly as he could, feeling the sharp gravel beneath his skin-thin shoes. He glanced up once or twice to make sure that the sky was still inky black. The first sign of the sun would mean that the shadow creature had materialized in the waking world, and Diane was only 2 or 3 feet away from Lenny's bed.
"Where are you, you bastard?" he whispered. "Where the hell are you?"
Suddenly, Oromas I screeched out loud, a screech so agonized that Reblax didn't understand at first that it was him. But the reflexes of Reblax the runner were instantaneous, and even before he fully realized who it was, he was sprinting around the sepulchre to the other side. When he saw what had happened, he stopped in a slither of gravel. High above him, nearly 20 feet tall, reared the thunderous black shape of the shadow creature, like the heaped-up black coats of 1,000 dead men. Out of the darkness of its body, its claws protruded, curving and shiny, and Oromas I was clutched in these claws, his dark blue armor crushed. His head, already half severed from his body, dangled down his back like a hood. The shadow creature was shaking him violently, so that his arms and legs swung in a hideous parody of dancing. Reblax shrieked, "Bastard! Let him go!" The shadow creature tossed Oromas I's body away and breathed a thin, sour stream of freezing breath at Reblax and clashed its claws. Reblax stepped back, and then back again. He didn't even have his wire to protect himself. The shadow creature shuffled forward once more, hissing, but then Reblax stood his ground. He had suddenly realized something. The shadow creature didn't frighten him. He wasn't afraid to die. When he thought of death, all he thought about was relief from his paralysis, relief from pain, and the chance to rejoin Virginia and Jennifer. He would miss Lenny, but Lenny was young. Lenny would be able to make a life for himself, and he would always have his father's spirit watching over him. The sensation was extraordinary. Reblax felt totally invincible. But he wasn't going to sacrifice his life for nothing at all. He had a duty to stay alive, to protect Diane and to protect Lenny, and to destroy this shadow creature forever. He stood in front of it, waiting, ready to make a run for safety if he had to. He was, after all, the fastest runner imaginable, or even unimaginable. The shadow creature remained where it was, the ground trembling beneath it. Perhaps it could sense that Reblax was no longer afraid of it. Perhaps it knew that, if he were to run, not even the wind could catch up with him. Whatever the reason, the shadow creature remained where it was, its claws slowly scraping against the marble of Lenny's schoolbook sepulchre, waiting, thinking. Then, without any warning at all, it seemed to fold up like a huge black umbrella and vanished. Reblax almost panicked. If the shadow creature had vanished, that meant that it had materialized in the waking world. That meant that now, at this instant, Diane was facing the most vicious and soulless beast that had ever stalked the earth. He stumbled across to Oromas 1, hoping that Oromas 1 might still be alive enough to project him back to reality. But Oromas 1's neck was a tangle of slashed gristle, and the shadow creature's claws had cut through his armor like a chainsaw through a tin can. Reblax tried some of the switches on Oromas 1's power grill. Oromas's psychic energy was fully charged up, but Reblax had no idea how to convert it to his own use. He knelt back on his heels. His only chance of saving Diane now was to see if he could find the other night warriors and get Oromas 2 to take him back. But by now, it was probably too late for that. Too late for anything. As he knelt by Oromas 1's body, the sun began to break through the clouds, and a small brown phoebe settled on the sepulchre and began to sing. At that moment, a shadow fell across the cracked marble, then another, and a hauntingly familiar voice said, "John?" Reblax turned around. Standing a few feet away on the weedy path was Virginia, in a flower-pink summer dress. Beside her stood a tall figure in slabby crimson armor, a figure who was unquestionably a night warrior, although not a night warrior Reblax recognized. "John, this is Kha'Zix," said Virginia. "I found him on the beach. He said he wanted to meet up with other night warriors, so I brought him here to you." Reblax stood up shakily, walked over to Virginia, and laid a hand on her shoulder. "Virginia, you are blessed by God." "Kha'Zix, Springer told me all about you. You're a charge keeper, aren't you?" Kha'Zix shook his hand.
"I was, until I discharged all of my energy trying to blow that shadow creature away."
"Well, quick! My own charge keeper has just been killed. Is there any way that you can use his power? And please, hurry! The shadow creature just left the dream world, and it's in the material world." Kha'Zix knelt down beside Oromas 1. He hesitated for just a moment at the sight of Oromas 1's ravaged neck, then quickly glanced over his power grill.
"Almost full," he remarked.
He unhooked an insulated lead from the side of his own armor and connected it quickly to the side of Oromas 1's power grill, the side to which Oromas 2 used to connect himself to give the twins double power. Kha'Zix threw 3 levers, ka-chunk, 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 and then there was an immediate crackling of psychic energy as he drained Oromas 1's system and topped up his own.
After less than 10 seconds, he glanced up at the instruments inside his helmet and said, "That's it. Full. Let's go." He stood up and drew the blue octagon in the air. As he did so, Virginia stepped away and waved, and smiled at Reblax with a regretful smile. "I love you," he mouthed as the octagon descended over him, "and thank you, whatever happens." Reblax closed his eyes as Kha'Zix transported him through time and space and silent imagination. For one instant, he didn't know whether he was alive or dead. He blinked, his eyes open. He was standing in Lenny's room in the police department headquarters, with Kha'Zix right next to him. The room was almost totally dark, but Reblax could see at once that Lenny was still asleep. He could also see that Diane was gone, although her video equipment was lying overturned on the floor. Diane was gone, and so was the staff of Moses. There was no sign of the shadow creature. "Where are we?" Kha'Zix asked, blundering into Reblax's back. "Police headquarters. But what's more to the point, where's the goddamn shadow creature?" Kha'Zix said, "Hold on, and I'll tell you." He switched on the sensors on his helmet and quickly scanned the building. "There," he said, "up on the roof, judging from the signals, and a darn sight bigger than it was when I went after it. It's stuffed itself on a little more fear and darkness since then," Reblax told him. "Come on, let's get after it." "If you insist," said Kha'Zix, without much enthusiasm. They rose through the building until they reached the roof. The lights of Philadelphia spread out all around them, and the night was heavy and warm. Quickly they looked around, and on the opposite side of the roof, close to the edge, Reblax saw Diane. She was kneeling, her arms raised. The night was so dark that he didn't see the shadow creature at first. It towered over Diane, its claws hooked back, and its teeth bared, and its eyes glinting yellow. Reblax had never seen it expose itself so openly before. It was even more grotesque than he had imagined. All the black and twisted ropes of human fear turned into a living being. "Diane!" he shouted. "Diane!" Because he was nothing more than a dream being, Diane could scarcely hear him. But she turned her head and frowned in his direction. Reblax ran across the asphalt helicopter pad. As he came closer, he saw that she was holding up the staff of Moses, and that the staff appeared to be keeping the shadow creature at bay. She must have snatched it when she first saw the shadow creature materialize and run up here. The shadow creature roared thunderously as it sensed that Reblax had returned from the world of dreams. It slashed at the air with its claws, ripping up asphalt and striking sparks. But Diane held her ground. She had to. She was right at the very edge of the roof, with her back against the low parapet. "Diane!" Reblax shouted. "Diane, give me the staff!" Kha'Zix was close behind him. "You won't be able to hold it. It's a material artifact. You're nothing but a dream. It'll drop straight through your hands." The shadow creature sensed Diane's heightening fear and scratched its way closer across the roof. "Stay back!" she shouted at it, her voice close to hysteria. "Stay back!" She tried to move to the side to escape from the edge of the building, but the shadow creature lunged at her, and its claws flew so close to her head that they lifted her hair. She screamed, dodged, then stumbled. The staff fell to the ground and rolled away. Now the shadow creature rose up like a mounting thunderstorm. It bellowed in freezing triumph and advanced on Diane with its claws sliding along the asphalt. Reblax had never heard a noise like it in his life. It was the sliding sound of imminent death. He darted forward and snatched for the staff. To his surprise, he could feel it, hold it.
It had as much solidity in the world of dreams as it did in reality. He turned to Kha'Zix, lifted it up and shook it. Kha'Zix, baffled, now knowing what it was or what it represented, shouted, "Go for it!" Just as the shadow creature raised its claws for a single murderous slash at Diane's body, Reblax stepped right in front of it, holding up the staff. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," he cried out, "I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me, and thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Even as he uttered these words, the upraised staff burst into dazzling light and became in his hand a rod so brilliant that he couldn't even look at it. White fire streamed out of it in all directions, lighting up the roof, lighting up the clouds, shining over the rooftops of Philadelphia in an incandescent beacon of hope and purity and total fearlessness. The shadow creature shrank and writhed and lashed out at Reblax again and again, but Reblax was unafraid. He walked toward the monster with the blinding white staff upraised. He kept walking deep into the creature's very being. Its flesh spat and crackled. Its nerves shriveled up. It collapsed on top of itself, fold after fold of black and thunderous fabric, as if all the tents of all the multitudes of terror were being struck, one after the other. In a last shuddering effort to escape, the shadow creature swept its arm at Reblax and knocked him aside. The dazzling staff fell onto the rooftop, out of his reach. With a rushing, rumbling noise, the shadow creature fled toward the edge of the roof, like the Phantom of the Opera leaping through the scenery of the Paris Opera House, like Bill Sikes leaping from the rooftops of Victorian London. It thrust itself into the air and spread billowing black wings. It flapped them once, twice, gaining height. But its whole being had been burned up. Its strength was gone, and it began to stagger in the air and then to fall. Kha'Zix hobbled right to the edge of the parapet and pointed his outstretched fingers at the shadow creature as it lurched and flapped in the air. "Negative power!" shouted Reblax. "Otherwise you'll give it all the energy it needs." Kha'Zix lifted his left hand to acknowledge that he had understood. Then thousands of volts of negative psychic energy spat from his fingertips and hit the shadow creature as it tried to fly. This was Oramas I's revenge, his last blow against the fear of death. There was a sharp implosion, blacker and darker and denser than anything that Reblax had ever seen. The shadow creature was sucked into it and compressed into a single black atom. There was a soft thudding of thunder as it disappeared, as the air rushed in to fill the space that it had left. Diane was left on the roof, apparently alone. "John?" she called. "John!" She went across to the fallen staff. Dull now, nothing but olive wood. She picked it up and held it in both hands. "Thank you," she whispered to the dark night sky. "Thank you, whoever you are." She felt something brush her lips, almost like a kiss. Yet, when she put her hand out, there didn't seem to be anybody there. Chapter 18. They were sitting under the cedar tree when John was wheeled out to join them. They greeted him with whistles and loud applause, and Toussaint struck a chord on his guitar. Sister Claire made sure that the plaid blanket was tucked tight around his legs, and then she pushed him close to his friends. "Don't be overexciting yourself," she warned him. "You know what Dr. Freitag said." "It's all right, Sister Claire," John said, smiling. "I'm hardly likely to excite myself with this gang of paralyzed boors." "Now then," said Billy, "just because you can wave your arms around now, and just because you're going to be able to walk in a year or two, that's no call to get prejudiced.
Just remember, you were a cripple once."
"I'll never forget it either," said John. "And don't you ever call yourself a cripple. Not in my earshot, anyway."
"How's Lenny?"
asked Cheu. "You'll be seeing him soon. Diane's supposed to be bringing him over. But he's fine. Diane told me that he baked some cookies for you guys. Baked them at school." "Just hope they're chocolate chip," said Mean Dean, his cigarette waggling between his lips. "I don't eat any other kind but chocolate chip."
"Are you going to refuse them if they're not?"
Toussaint asked. "Refuse them? I'm going to grind them underfoot." He looked down at the neatly folded blanket where his legs were supposed to be and laughed. "I'm going to find it hard to forget that I was Themesteroth. Believe me."
John said, "You're always going to be Themesteroth, as long as you live." He looked around at all of them and added, "You're always going to be night warriors. And it doesn't matter who looks down at you, or who ignores you, even when you're sitting right in front of them, or who treats you like a child, or a moron, or an idiot. You're night warriors. Your legs and your arms are inside your dreams, and nobody can take that away from you." Just then, Diane appeared with Lenny. Her hair was brushed and shining, and she was wearing a new white summer dress that John hadn't seen before. Lenny ran over to John and hugged him tight, and then Diane came over and gave him a kiss that had the rest of the night warriors whistling and wolf howling. "I talked to Dr. Freitag," said Diane. "He says you're going to make an 85% recovery, maybe better. Oh, John, I'm so pleased." He stiffly raised one arm and touched her cheek. It was the first time he'd been able to touch her since they'd met. She pressed his hand against her cheek, and her eyes filled with sparkling tears. Dean said to Lenny, "Hey, champ, how about those cookies?" "Oh, sure," said Lenny, and produced a large brown paper sack. "There are 10 cookies each, and each bag has your name on it." He delved inside the brown paper sack and took out smaller bags of cookies, which he handed around one by one. On each bag was written in large, childish writing, "Thank you from your friend Lenny." Dean carefully opened his bag and peered inside. Lenny said anxiously, "They're chocolate chip. I only know how to make chocolate chip." Dean nodded and took out one of the cookies and bit into it. They all waited until he had swallowed his first mouthful. "You know something?" he said. "This is the best goddamn chocolate chip cookie I ever tasted in my whole goddamn life." Lenny came up to him and grinned, his face bright. "You mean that?" "You calling me a liar?" Dean retorted. "I'll arm wrestle you for that." As they scrapped and wrestled, John turned to Diane and said, "I want to thank you, too. We never could have made it without you. Any other psychic researcher would have done the same. I want you to send my thanks to Seth Maxwell, too, and everybody else at the university." Diane smiled. "I'll tell Seth tonight. He's taking me out to dinner." "Oh?" John queried sharply. She laughed. "It's not what you think. He's found out some more about Nathan Grant, some old Osage legend." "Really?" "Don't sound so skeptical. Just because Seth has a thing about my legs." "So, what's this legend?" "It's interesting, and from what we already know about Nathan Grant, it seems to fit the historical facts. According to the Osage Indians, they were approached by a white horse doctor called Grant, who was dying of some kind of wasting disease, muscular dystrophy probably. Grant made a deal with an Osage medicine man. In return for being cured, Grant would allow his daughters to be impregnated by an evil spirit, and he would carry these embryonic evil spirits deep into the heart of the white man's government, so that white men would always argue with each other and never be able to form a united nation that would threaten the Indians' heritage.
Does the legend say what happened after that?
Diane shook her head. I don't think the Osages ever found out. But we did.
They talked together for a while as the sun sank over Philadelphia. At last, when it began to grow cooler, Sister Claire came out and said that John had to return to bed. Tomorrow, he was going to begin his therapy sessions. John kissed Diane and Lenny goodbye. As they left, however, another familiar figure appeared, Norman Clay, on his own this time, in a shiny grey summer suit and dark glasses. He came across to John and held out his hand.
I hear you did good,
he said a little hoarsely. John nodded.
Yes, thanks, Norman. I did.
I'm leaving Philly tomorrow, said Norman. Got myself a job in Seattle. Security guard. That's a long way to go.
Well, not really. Thaddeus is always going to be there, wherever I go. You know how sensitive I am. I can hear him every night, talking to me just like always, even though his armchair's empty.
John said, I'm sorry, Norman. I'll never forget Thaddeus, never.
We lost him in a good cause, John.
John nodded. He wondered for a moment whether any cause was worth losing a man like Thaddeus.
Come on, Mr. Woods, urged Sister Claire. We have to be bathed, and then we have to get some beauty sleep.
Jawohl, sister.
Norman said, I had a letter from Henry Watkins this morning, you know, Cassock's. He's some kind of philosophy professor out in California. It was a good letter. He said that without Thaddeus, we never could have done what we did, and that as long as he lives, there's always going to be some little piece of Thaddeus right inside him someplace.
I'm glad, said John gently. At last, they said their goodbyes, and Sister Claire wheeled John into the hospital. She gave him his usual bed bath, while he closed his eyes and tried to remember those last desperate moments in the Byzantine church and the world that was tilted sideways, and their fight with the shadow creature on the roof of the Philadelphia police headquarters. Those moments had all been a dream, and now they seemed like nothing more than a dream. He watched television for a while. Then he reached up and switched off the light, which he still considered a great achievement. He thought of Lenny, and he thought of Diane, and he thought of the tragedies that had led at last to their security and their freedom. He was on the edge of falling asleep when he heard the door of his room open and the rustling sound of somebody coming in. He opened his eyes and listened. Then, summoning up all the strength and the coordination that he could manage, he raised his head. Standing at the end of the bed, white-faced, wearing her blood-stained nightdress, was Jennifer.
Jennifer,
he whispered.
Jennifer.
That was Death Dream by Graham Masterton, read by Mark Meadows. This was the second book in the Night Warriors series. Be sure to check out the other audiobooks in the series, available from all good audiobook retailers. Produced by Chatterbox Audio for Bloomsbury Publishing plc. Produced by Deryn Edwards, with post-production by Loban Tatlow and Mark Lindors. Text copyright Graham Masterton, 1991. Recording copyright Bloomsbury Publishing plc, 2023. All rights reserved. Thank you for listening.
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.